Welcome. Tonight, we are stepping into the quiet, shadowed heart of the forest, a place where the trees hold secrets, and the wind carries stories that never reach the daylight. For years, hikers have disappeared along these trails, cabins have been abandoned in sudden haste, and paths have twisted back on themselves in ways that make the forest feel alive. As we move deeper into these woods, I want you to take it slow. Let your senses settle. Hear the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant cry of an unseen animal, the faint snap of a twig. You may feel as though you are being watched, because, in a way, you are. Tonight, we will wander together through abandoned trails, forgotten campsites, and old ranger stations. We will listen to echoes of the past, to whispers left in the shadows. There are no sudden scares, only the creeping sense that the forest remembers everything, and that it has not forgotten you. So settle in, breathe slowly, and allow the night to unfold around you. The stories we'll share are not always easy to hear, but they are real. And once you enter these woods, you may never see the quiet of night the same way again. Let us begin. I remember the first time I stumbled onto the trail. I wasn't looking for it, not really. I had been wandering through the pines, following the thin ribbon of the main path that I'd been told led to a small creek. The forest was quiet, softer than usual, like it had pressed a hand over its own mouth. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of fallen needles and moss, and there was a stillness that made each footstep sound louder than it had any right to. It wasn't long before I noticed the faint hint of a side trail, almost hidden by overgrown ferns. It wasn't on my map, which made it immediately suspicious. But something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the way the sunlight dappled the ground, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the chill crawl along the back of my neck. Then, quietly, I stepped off the main path. The trail itself was narrow and uneven, lined with brambles and low-hanging branches that snagged my jacket. The forest grew thicker here, the trees closer together, their trunks dark and rough, some split open by age or storm. Shadows pooled around their roots, and I began to feel that unsettling awareness of being watched. Though I couldn't see anything, no eyes, no movement, just a sense. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but the wind wasn't moving. The leaves were still. As I went further, I started noticing small things. A boot print here, partially filled with rainwater. A piece of torn cloth caught on a branch. It was old, months, maybe years, but it made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. The trail wound deeper, twisting and turning, and with every bend, I felt that the forest itself was leaning in, watching, waiting. I tried to focus on the sunlight filtering through the canopy, tried to find comfort in the golden streaks breaking through. But the shadows seemed to stretch and curl toward me, like they didn't belong to the trees. At some point, I realized I wasn't hearing the normal sounds of the forest. The birds had gone silent. The squirrels, the insects, even the distant murmur of the creek were gone. It was a quiet so complete it pressed into my ears. Every rustle of leaves beneath my boots echoed, like it was amplified. And I could swear I heard a faint crack, like someone stepping on a twig behind me. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. Nothing. Only the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my chest, loud and insistent. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look back, though every few steps I felt compelled to. Nothing ever appeared, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the forest was breathing around me, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm just slightly off from mine. Occasionally, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of my vision, too quick to see clearly, like shadows folding over themselves. But every time I blinked, it was gone. I tried to reason it away, a trick of the light, my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The trail began to change. The trees were older now, gnarled, their roots tangled together across the path. The air smelled sharper here, like a mix of damp soil and something metallic, almost iron-like. I reached down and touched a tree trunk. It was rough. And when my fingers lingered, I thought I felt something else beneath the bark. Soft and thin, like a layer of skin. I pulled my hand back too quickly, telling myself I was imagining it. I couldn't be. My stomach churned as I moved forward. Then I found the campsite. It was small, almost hidden in a clearing. A rusted, collapsed tent frame, a few burned logs blackened and crumbling. Nothing human had touched it for years. I knelt down, brushing away layers of dirt and leaves. Bits of paper, yellowed and torn, littered the ground. One had a name scrawled in shaky handwriting. Another had words I couldn't make out anymore, faded beyond recognition. My heart started to hammer harder. This wasn't just an abandoned trail anymore. It was a place people had left in a hurry or never returned from. I tried to leave the papers where they lay, tried to convince myself to walk away and return to the main trail. But something drew me in. A subtle shift in the wind, maybe, or a quiet murmur that I almost didn't hear. I bent closer to the ground, examining the footprints and faint impressions left behind. Some were small, like children's shoes. Others were larger, heavier. And then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw them. Tiny scratches in the dirt, in a pattern that made no sense. Not footprints, something else, something deliberate, something watching. The forest was growing darker, even though it was still early afternoon. The shadows of the trees seemed to thicken, pooling around me like ink. I could feel a presence behind me, closer now. But I told myself again, and again it was the wind, or a deer, or my own mind playing tricks. But the pressure on my chest, the tightness in my throat was real. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn and run. But some invisible thread held me there, rooted to the earth, to the whispers I couldn't quite hear. I stepped back from the clearing, trying to retrace my steps. The path, though familiar a moment ago, had shifted. The trees were in slightly different positions. The trail twisted in ways it hadn't before. My pace quickened, and still I felt the eyes, the invisible gaze following me. Counting my steps, learning my rhythm. I told myself I was imagining it, but I knew better. There was something here that didn't want me to leave. Or maybe something that didn't want me to understand. The whispers began then. Soft at first, barely audible, like the wind rubbing against the leaves. They weren't words, not in any language I knew. Just sounds, hissing, clicking, breathing, shifting. I froze, my ears straining. They grew slightly louder, then faded, then returned. Circling me in patterns I couldn't predict. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't respond the way I wanted it to. It was like I was moving through molasses, each step heavier than the last. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The sun had sunk lower, leaving the forest in a dim green twilight. The air was colder now, sharper. I stumbled upon another clearing, smaller this time. A single, moss-covered stump stood in the center. I sank to my knees, exhausted, trying to steady my breath. That's when I realized the whispers weren't coming from the trees anymore. They were inside my head. Soft, almost coaxing. Familiar tones like voices I should have recognized. Names, places, warnings. But scrambled, wrong. Wrong in ways that made my stomach twist. I stayed there for a long time, listening, until the first stars appeared through the canopy. I finally forced myself to my feet, shaking, heart pounding. The trail back seemed slightly clearer now, less tangled, almost welcoming. I didn't stop to look back, though every instinct screamed that I should. I kept walking, one careful step at a time, until I finally reached the edge of the forest, where the main trail met the clearing. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel it, the brush of unseen eyes against my skin, the faint, lingering sound of whispers carried on a wind that isn't there anymore. And sometimes, late at night, I imagine someone walking that forgotten trail, unaware of the forest that waits, watching, always waiting, for the next person who thinks they're alone. I didn't expect to find anything beyond the trail I had wandered the day before. I thought it was just a forgotten path, overgrown and swallowed by the forest. But as I stepped further in, the air grew colder, heavier. Like the forest itself had settled into a memory, and I could feel it pressing on me. There were remnants everywhere, small, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. The first campsite I stumbled upon was barely a clearing at all. A few stones arranged in a circle, blackened and cracked from old fires. The smell of ash lingered faintly, though the fire had long since turned to dust. I knelt, brushing my fingers through the dirt, and found scraps of paper, yellowed, water-stained. The edges were jagged, torn carelessly. One had a drawing almost childlike, a stick figure under a tall tree. Another had a list of names, some crossed out, some smudged beyond recognition. I didn't know whose hands had held these papers, or how long they had been left behind. It was the quiet that made it unsettling. The wind whispered, curling through the branches above me, carrying sounds that almost formed words. Not language exactly, more like echoes of laughter, sighs, or someone calling my name softly from just beyond the tree line. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was my imagination. But the forest had a rhythm I couldn't ignore, a pulse I could feel in my chest. Each beat seemed to sync with my own, making my steps heavier, more deliberate, as though the forest were nudging me forward. I moved on, following a faint trail that twisted between the trees. The ground was littered with leaves and pine needles, hiding old footprints. Some were small, almost childlike. Others were large, booted, indiscernible in age. Every few steps I stumbled on something left behind: a tin cup, a half-broken backpack, a worn jacket, its color faded to a dull brown. I picked up one of the objects, held it in my hands. The weight of it was strange, heavier than it should have been. And when I looked up, the clearing I thought I had passed earlier was closer than I remembered. I began to notice patterns in the way things were left behind. It wasn't messy or random. There was a sort of order, subtle, almost ritualistic. Rocks stacked in small piles near the remnants of fires. Twigs arranged in lines leading deeper into the forest. I couldn't see why anyone would do it, or what it meant, but I felt the forest watching me notice. It was patient, silent, letting me look, letting me breathe, before letting me understand that I was not alone. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft and careful, not breaking twigs or rustling leaves. When I turned, nothing moved, nothing breathed. Only the sway of the trees, their long shadows stretching across the ground, and the faint traces of paths leading further into the unknown. The forest seemed endless, and yet every time I paused, I felt that someone or something was just beyond sight, tracing my movements, letting me feel the brush of attention without revealing itself. I reached another campsite, larger this time. An old tent frame sagged under the weight of moss and decay. Nearby, a rusted canteen and a small wooden box, its lid hanging open, revealed fragments of cloth and a few personal items. A pair of glasses with one lens missing, a photograph torn down the middle, a notebook whose pages had curled with damp. I could almost imagine the people who had been here, unpacking their belongings, talking quietly, then disappearing without a trace. The air felt heavier around me, saturated with the memory of their presence. I lingered, kneeling beside the remnants. I could feel the energy of absence, the kind that presses softly against your skin and lingers in your chest. It was not violent, not cruel, just expectant. I could almost hear the echoes of conversations, fragments of words, laughter that didn't belong to me, the faint sighs of someone trying not to be noticed. And then the wind shifted, brushing against my ears like soft breath, carrying with it a whisper I couldn't fully hear. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was older, patient, something that had been waiting for me to listen. I wandered further, drawn to a narrow trail that led up a slight incline. There, half hidden under a fallen log, was another clue, a small bundle of sticks tied together with twine, and inside, a collection of items too personal to be ignored. A threadbare scarf, a pocket knife with a handle worn smooth, and a single shoe, small, brown, caked with dirt. It made my stomach twist. I didn't know who these things had belonged to or what had happened, but the forest seemed to hum around them. A quiet song of memory and absence. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to fold in on itself. Shadows pooled unnaturally, wrapping the bases of trees in darkness even though the sunlight reached through the canopy in thin beams. I started to see shapes at the edge of my vision, shapes that moved too deliberately to be random. Branches that bent when no wind touched them, leaves that shifted as if someone had brushed past them moments before. I would blink and they would vanish, leaving nothing but the normal sway of foliage and the soft crunch of my own boots. There was a clearing ahead that made me pause. It was small, encircled by ancient oaks. On the ground were dozens of small, almost imperceptible carvings, initials, symbols I didn't recognize, shapes scratched into the bark of fallen trees. They were faded, some half covered by moss, some freshly etched. I could feel the intent behind them, the need for someone to mark this place, to leave proof that they had been here, or perhaps to call to something unseen. I traced my fingers over one of the carvings. The wood was rough, dry, but under my touch it almost seemed to vibrate softly, like a quiet heartbeat. I stayed there longer than I meant to, staring at the carvings, listening. The whispers had grown more distinct now, curling around me in the wind. They weren't clear words still, but I could almost make out patterns, voices layering over each other, murmuring names, places, fragments of memories. It was disorienting, like hearing echoes from a past that wasn't mine, but somehow carried the weight of everyone who had walked these trails before me. Eventually, I realized the sun had moved lower. The forest was dimming, green light fading to shadow. I had to leave. But as I turned back toward the trail I had come from, I realized it wasn't where I remembered it. The trees had shifted, the underbrush rearranged itself. I felt the gaze again, quiet but unrelenting, tracking every step I took. My pace quickened, though my body felt heavy, uncooperative, as if the forest itself resisted letting me go. I didn't look back, but I could feel it behind me, just beyond the line of sight, patient and silent. The whispers lingered in my ears as I stumbled through the pines, carried on a wind that didn't exist. Every now and then I thought I saw someone, or something, watching from the shadows, but when I blinked there was nothing. Only the memory of what had been left behind, scattered across the ground like breadcrumbs, and the quiet certainty that I was not the first, and would not be the last, to walk this forgotten trail. When I finally emerged onto the main path, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. My hands trembled as I brushed dirt and leaves from my jacket. The forest behind me was quiet again, still, the way it had been when I first entered. But I knew better now. I knew the echoes of the past were still there, hiding in every shadow, whispering softly for anyone willing to listen. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear them, soft, patient, waiting for the next footsteps to follow. The mist had started to roll in before I realized it. At first, it was just a light haze that softened the edges of the trees, making the forest feel like it was breathing quietly around me. But within minutes, it thickened, curling between the trunks and over the roots, settling into every hollow. It clung to my boots, dampening the leaves and needles underfoot, and carried a chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The trail I had been following began to disappear beneath it, and the world around me felt smaller, tighter, like I was walking inside a glass globe. I slowed my steps, listening to the soft crunch of my boots and the occasional drip of condensation falling from leaves. Shadows danced strangely in the mist, stretching longer than they should have, folding over each other in ways that didn't make sense. Every so often, I thought I saw a shape shift, a dark outline moving just beyond the fog, but whenever I blinked or shifted my gaze, it was gone. I told myself it was just the mist playing tricks, but the feeling didn't fade. It pressed against my senses, whispering that I wasn't truly alone. Then I saw the footprints. At first I thought they were animal tracks, long, uneven, too wide to be deer, too deliberate for anything smaller. But as I leaned closer, I realized they weren't quite right. They weren't perfectly human either. The toes seemed longer than they should have been, clawed perhaps, and the spacing of the steps suggested a gait that no ordinary person could walk. I followed them cautiously, my hands brushing along tree trunks for balance, my heart beat loud in the silence. The tracks weaved in impossible directions, circling back, crossing over themselves as if whoever, or whatever, made them had been walking in patterns meant to confuse. The forest around me had changed. The trees felt older, their trunks twisted unnaturally, roots reaching out like gnarled fingers, and the mist made them loom closer than they actually were. Shapes moved in the periphery, subtle bends in branches, patches of darkness that flickered and then vanished. I tried to keep my mind rational, focusing on the smell of damp earth, the soft scratch of leaves beneath my boots. But my thoughts kept returning to the tracks, the way they defied explanation, the sense that someone, or something, was guiding me, letting me see just enough to realize I was not alone. A sound rose from the mist, almost beneath the threshold of hearing. A low, rustling shuffle, like someone moving slowly over fallen leaves. I froze, straining my ears, but when I turned, there was nothing. Just the fog curling around the trunks, the faint glimmer of sunlight reaching through in streaks that seemed too thin to matter. I swallowed, forcing my hands to stop shaking. The trail continued, and I followed, each step heavier than the last. I had to see where it led, had to understand what was being left behind. The mist thickened further, swallowing the sunlight entirely. The forest became monochrome, gray, and muted, and the sense of isolation deepened. Shapes moved again at the edges of my vision. Long limbs, bent backs, something crouched low and then rising. I tried to convince myself they were branches, twisted trunks, natural shadows. But the way they shifted felt deliberate, intelligent. I couldn't see faces, couldn't make out features, but I felt observation. Patient, silent, unblinking. I came to another small clearing. The ground was littered with rocks, sticks, and broken branches, arranged in patterns that made my stomach twist. A circle almost perfect, with a smaller ring inside. I knelt, brushing away the fallen leaves, and saw impressions in the dirt that were neither human nor animal. They were oddly symmetrical, delicate but deliberate. I traced one with my finger. It felt like a message I could almost understand, something left for anyone wandering too close. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest whisper through the mist. Not words, not language, just a sound, soft and coaxing, tugging at my thoughts. I felt compelled to continue, drawn deeper into the mist. Every tree looked different now, each one looming taller, darker, like the forest itself had decided to grow around me. The fog clung to my clothes, my hair, and my skin, making me aware of every inch of my body. My boots left prints that disappeared almost immediately, as if the forest was erasing my presence the way it had shown me the other traces. And then I saw it, a figure distant and dark standing between two trees. I couldn't tell how far away it was. It didn't move in a normal way. more like a shadow lifted from the ground, swaying slightly, waiting. I froze, heart hammering, breath shallow. I wanted to run, wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't approach, it didn't retreat. It simply waited perfectly still, as if testing me. My mind raced with explanations. Someone lost, a hiker. No, too precise, too unnatural. My skin crawled with the certainty that this was something else entirely, something patient and aware. The mist thickened, wrapping around the figure, blurring its edges until it seemed almost part of the fog itself. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. Each movement felt amplified in the silence, my boots crunching softly over the damp leaves. The figure didn't react. It remained in place, a dark blot in the gray mist. I realized that leaving wouldn't be simple. The forest had already changed. The trail that had brought me here no longer followed a straight path. It looped, twisted, hiding and revealing itself like a living thing. I was aware of every tree, every shadow, every shift in the fog. The forest wasn't just around me, it was inside me. I continued along the trail, forced forward by a mix of curiosity and fear. The footprints continued, sometimes disappearing only to reappear moments later in a pattern that made no sense. I began to hear more whispers now, curling around my ears, soft and indistinct. I wanted to turn away, but the forest had me. Every sound, every movement, every shadow seemed designed to pull me onward, to keep me walking until I understood, or until I didn't. At one point, the mist thinned slightly, revealing another clearing. This one was smaller, enclosed by trees whose trunks leaned inward as if bowing to some unseen presence. On the ground lay scattered belongings, a tattered coat, a small, rusted tin, a notebook with pages curling from moisture. I picked up the notebook, flipping carefully through it. Most of the pages were blank or illegible, but some had strange symbols scratched across them, sharp and jagged. I traced them with my finger, feeling the imprint in the paper, and a shiver ran down my spine. The mist seemed to thicken around me as if reacting, pressing against me, urging me to leave, but also to stay. The whispers grew louder, soft breaths and faint rustles that seemed to echo just beyond my line of sight. My pulse raced, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides. Each step forward felt like moving through molasses. The trees shifted slightly in the corners of my vision, branches bending, shadows stretching, shapes moving that weren't there a moment ago. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware of me, waiting to see what I would do next. Eventually, I reached the far edge of the mist. The air lightened, the trees returned to their natural spacing, and the forest seemed normal again. But I knew better. I could feel the memory of the mist clinging to me, the echoes of the shapes and footprints and whispers that had followed me through the shadows. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can see those strange impressions, feel the soft pressure of unseen eyes, and hear the faintest murmur of voices that never speak. The forest had revealed itself, just enough, and I knew it would be waiting always for anyone foolish enough to wander in too far. I thought I understood the forest by the time I reached that part of the trail, but I was wrong. I realized quickly that the longer you walk these forgotten paths, the more they seem to walk you too. Every step I took, the forest seemed to adjust, bending and stretching in ways that felt deliberate, as if it were guiding me, herding me deeper into itself. By late afternoon, the sun had sunk low, slanting thin shafts of gold through the canopy, but the shadows beneath the trees had already begun to thicken, pooling around roots and underbrush. The air was damp and cold, clinging to my skin, and I could hear the soft hiss of mist curling over the ground in pockets where sunlight hadn't reached. Each step felt heavier, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, my muscles stiffening as fatigue set in. I tried to focus on the sound of my own breathing, the rhythm of my heart, but there was a second rhythm there too. A subtle one, something else breathing, moving, unseen but present. I passed another old campsite, smaller than the last, almost hidden beneath a tangle of brambles. A few stones arranged in a circle, charred wood from a fire long extinguished, a bottle lying on its side with a faded label. I knelt, brushing dirt and moss away, and I thought I saw the faint outline of initials carved into a nearby tree trunk. The letters were old, weathered, but deliberate. Someone had been here. Someone had left traces of themselves, like breadcrumbs leading into a story I could only half understand. And then it started, the sense that I wasn't alone. At first it was subtle. A brush against my shoulder, light enough that I could have blamed the wind. The faint crunch of leaves behind me when I hadn't moved my feet. Tiny, almost imperceptible shifts in the air, like something had passed just beyond the edge of my vision. My pulse jumped each time. I tried to reason it away. Maybe an animal, maybe the forest playing tricks, but I knew it was more than that. The trail narrowed, the trees crowding in closer, their branches scraping softly against each other in a rhythm that seemed almost conversational. Shapes moved at the corners of my eyes, twisted trunks perhaps or shadows, but I couldn't tell. My mind told me they were natural, but my gut whispered differently. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing into me like a weight on my chest. I walked faster, though my limbs felt sluggish, and every so often I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the mist. Always still, always silent, always gone the moment I tried to look directly. By the time I reached the next clearing, the sun had dipped beneath the horizon, leaving only a pale light that barely penetrated the dense forest. The air had cooled, and with the change, the whispers returned. Not language, not words I could understand, just murmurs curling around my ears. I could almost make them out, fragments of conversations, half-formed thoughts, sighs of people who had walked here long before me. I froze, listening, heart hammering. It felt intimate, invasive, as though the forest wanted me to hear the things it had kept hidden. I took a few tentative steps forward and noticed the footprints again. Not human, not entirely. Large, uneven, clawed perhaps, and winding in ways that seemed impossible. Some crossed paths, some doubled back, others disappeared entirely only to reappear a few feet away. They weren't fresh, not in the sense that the soil had just been disturbed, but they were too vivid to be forgotten, too deliberate. And alongside them, strange impressions, triangular, circular, geometric, impossible to trace to any living creature I knew. I followed the prints cautiously, feeling the weight of the forest around me. The trees leaned closer now, their limbs stretched toward me like fingers, and I could feel the air grow heavier with each step. A faint sound, footsteps maybe or shifting leaves, echoed behind me. My instincts screamed to look, to turn around, but my body refused. I felt rooted, as if some unseen hand had pressed me into the soil. And then I understood. The forest didn't want to be watched. It wanted me to move forward, to follow, to learn what it was hiding. The clearing opened just enough for me to see the mist curling between the trees. Shapes moved within it, shadows that bent and stretched, some too high, some too low, defying the geometry of the forest. I could swear I saw eyes glinting faintly, reflecting what little light remained. And then suddenly, a sound that made me freeze completely. A soft, deliberate exhale close to my ear, though no one was there. My stomach twisted, my pulse spiking. I stepped back, heart hammering, scanning the clearing. Nothing, only the fog and the dim outlines of trees, the forest holding its secrets just out of reach. I tried to focus on my own movements, the crunch of boots, the rhythm of my breath. But the forest wasn't passive. Every step felt noticed, measured, catalogued. The shadows shifted as I passed. I would look ahead and something would move at the periphery, too fast to be a tree, too still to be an animal. a brush of movement at the edge of my vision. I blinked and it vanished. But the sense remained. I was being followed, though no one would ever show themselves fully. A gust of wind moved through the clearing, carrying with it a faint smell. Metallic, sharp, earthy. I stopped in my tracks. Something was buried here or had been. Something left behind, marking its territory, whispering to anyone who dared enter. The whispers grew louder, coiling around my thoughts. I could almost hear words, names, broken sentences, though nothing made sense. And the shadows, they shifted closer, subtle, almost welcoming, yet not. The forest was patient, and it had been waiting. I reached the far side of the clearing and saw another trail, narrower, overgrown, almost hidden. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the mist. Not a person, not entirely. Tall, elongated, draped in shadow, with limbs that didn't bend the way they should. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure remained still, perfectly still, yet I could feel its attention on me, measuring me, waiting. My throat tightened, and a cold sweat ran down my spine. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted, trapped by the forest and by the weight of its gaze. Minutes, or maybe seconds, passed. I don't know how long I stood there, eyes locked on that shape. Then the mist swirled, the figure shifting with it, bending, folding, and in a blink it was gone. Only the empty clearing remained, silent but heavy. I exhaled shakily, forcing my legs to move. Step by step, I followed the trail, boots crunching softly on damp needles and leaves. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corners of my vision. Branches bending, shadows stretching, shapes fleeting, but always gone when I looked directly. I reached another small clearing, barely more than a hollow in the ground, where old remnants of human presence lay scattered. A torn jacket, a rusted tin, fragments of paper. I knelt and examined them, feeling the weight of absence and memory. Someone had been here. Someone had left pieces of themselves, markers, reminders. And yet they were gone. The forest had claimed them as it had claimed others before me. I felt a chill run through me, realizing I might be next in that long chain of footsteps erased, swallowed, whispered away. By the time I emerged from the mist, the trail opened again to the wider forest. Moonlight filtered through the trees, pale and cold. I breathed heavily, exhausted, trembling, but the sense of being watched lingered. It didn't end when I stepped into the open. I could feel it in my back, the awareness of shapes, the soft whispering that trailed me, even in the clear air. The forest had revealed itself just enough, and yet not fully. Its presence lingered, patient and deliberate, reminding me that isolation was never complete here. I had thought I was alone, but the forest had other plans. Even now, when I lie awake at night, I can feel the weight of those shadows pressing in, the whispers curling around my mind. And sometimes in the quiet, I hear the soft, deliberate steps of something moving just out of sight, following, watching. Waiting, the forest is alive. And it has always been waiting. I had driven for hours, the road narrowing and twisting as I left the main highway behind. The GPS insisted I was still on course, though the trees pressed in on either side, thick and unmoving like a living wall. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and there was a hush that seemed unnatural, as if the forest had muted itself just for my arrival. I could feel every vibration through the tires, every crack in the asphalt amplified by the silence around me. The cabin came into view just as the sun was dipping low, staining the sky in muted oranges and purples. It was small, wooden, and aged in a way that suggested it had been here long before anyone bothered to notice. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged slightly in the center, and the steps leading up to the porch were warped from years of rain and neglect. Yet there was a certain charm in its isolation, a promise that I could finally disappear from the world for a few days. I parked and sat for a moment, staring at it, feeling the weight of the quiet. I had heard stories before I rented the place. Tales of people vanishing along the creek, hikers who never returned, locals speaking in hushed tones about the forest swallowing visitors whole. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself it was exaggeration, folklore designed to scare outsiders. But as I stepped out of the car, the wind brushing through the trees, I felt that old, familiar prickling on the back of my neck. The awareness that I wasn't entirely alone. The porch creaked under my weight as I approached the front door. I had packed lightly a few nights' clothes, a notebook, and a flashlight, though I didn't think I would need it yet. Still, the cabin seemed to breathe around me, waiting. I inserted the key and pushed the door open. Dust motes floated in the last rays of sunlight, and the air inside smelled of wood and thyme. A mixture of must and lingering warmth from fires long since burned out. I walked through the small living area, brushing my hands over the backs of chairs and the worn tabletop, listening to the echo of my own movements. The windows looked out into the woods on all sides. They were overgrown now, the brush curling against the glass, leaves pressed close. From inside, the forest seemed endless, a sea of green and shadow stretching far beyond what the eye could see. I could almost feel the forest watching me, waiting for me to make a move. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was aware, patient. As if it had seen this scene play out many times before. I found the bedroom and set my things down, unpacking slowly, trying to ignore the chill that had settled into my bones. The walls were thin, and I could hear the soft creak of wood settling, the occasional drip of water from the roof, even the subtle rustle of animals in the distance. Everything sounded louder than it should have, amplified by the quiet. I lay down on the bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening, letting the isolation seep in. It was complete, absolute, and it was unnerving in a way I hadn't anticipated. Dinner was simple, canned soup warmed over the small stove. But even that routine felt amplified in the silence. Every clink of a spoon against a bowl echoed through the cabin, through the walls, and out into the forest. I tried to tell myself it was cozy, that I had chosen this for a reason. But deep down, I could feel the weight of the place pressing on me. The stories, the disappearances, the whispers in local taverns, it all seemed more real now. Not threatening yet, but tangible. A quiet promise that the forest kept its own time and its own rules. After dinner, I explored a little outside. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped down, my boots crunching over the undergrowth. The creek was nearby, though it was hard to see through the trees. I could hear it, faint and steady, water gurgling over rocks and the occasional splash, though I couldn't tell if it was a fish, a fallen branch, or something else. I walked along the narrow path that led from the cabin toward the water, noticing the forest thickening, leaning closer to the trail. Branches brushing against my arms and shoulders. The further I went, the more I felt it. The same sensation I always felt in deep woods, the certainty that something unseen was observing, waiting. Aware of every movement I made, I returned to the cabin before night fully fell. The forest darkening around me. Shadows stretched long from the porch light, flickering over the walls as the trees swayed. I could hear the creek now more clearly, the soft rustle of the wind through the branches. Something about the rhythm was hypnotic, almost comforting. Yet I could not shake the awareness that the forest was larger, deeper, older than I could imagine, and that I was a guest in a place that did not forget its visitors. As night settled in fully, I lit a small lamp. The warm glow barely touched the corners of the room, leaving the rest in deep shadow. I sat in the rocking chair by the window, notebook in hand, trying to write down thoughts, observations, anything to anchor myself in reality. The wind stirred the trees outside, making them whisper in a language I couldn't understand. I wrote slowly, carefully, glancing up often, feeling the presence of the forest just beyond the glass. There was a sound then, soft, deliberate, almost like footsteps brushing through fallen leaves. I froze, listening. The forest outside the window remained still. I strained my ears, heart thumping, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was imagination, nerves, the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive. In a way I couldn't fully grasp. It wasn't malevolent, not yet, but it was aware. Patient, waiting for me to make a mistake, to stray too far, or to understand what had happened here before. I tried to sleep, but the cabin seemed to grow in size and silence at the same time. Walls stretching outward, shadows pooling where the light couldn't reach. Every creak, drip, rustle was louder than it had any right to be. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening, feeling the presence of the forest settle around me, knowing it had always been waiting for someone to arrive. The night stretched long and deep, filled with the quiet murmurs of trees and the soft murmur of the creek, carrying the sense that I was not alone. By the time I finally closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the woods pressing against the cabin walls, subtle and unyielding. I didn't know what had happened to the people who came before me, or what secrets Hollow Creek held, but I knew I had entered a space older than the stories, one that kept its own records and had its own patience. The forest outside would not forget me, not in the ways that mattered, and for the first time, I understood that isolation wasn't just the absence of people. It was the presence of a history that waited quietly, patiently, in the shadows, watching for the living to arrive. The first night passed with little more than the usual creaks and sighs of the old cabin settling. I told myself I was imagining things, the shadows stretching too long, the whispers that weren't really there. But when I woke before dawn, I noticed something strange, a faint, flickering glow through the trees, just beyond the edge of the creek. At first, I thought it was moonlight catching the water, but it danced and moved in ways that the moon could not. I stepped onto the porch, the boards groaning under my weight, and squinted into the darkness. The lights were low, soft orange-yellow, like lanterns or torches bobbling through the dense woods. They didn't follow any obvious path. Sometimes one would vanish entirely, only for another to appear farther along, moving with a rhythm I couldn't predict. I felt a shiver run down my spine, even though I had been alone for hours. The forest seemed alive in a way that went beyond trees and wind. I remembered the stories I had heard from locals, hikers and campers disappearing along Hollow Creek, strange lights seen in the distance, footprints that didn't belong to any animal, whispers carried on the wind. At the time, I thought it was the kind of tale told to outsiders, meant to keep them away. But standing there, watching the lights flicker and bob, I felt that old, familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that tells you something is wrong, and that the wrongness is patient. Deliberate, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch. Moving slowly toward the nearest flicker, the forest seemed different at night. Thicker, more deliberate, every shadow seemed to lean toward me. Every branch stretched unnaturally. The mist that had been rolling in during the late afternoon had thickened, curling along the ground, softening the outlines of the trees, and obscuring the trail. I tried to keep my bearings, but it was difficult. The forest had a way of rearranging itself at night, of folding pathways and hiding familiar landmarks. The lights danced ahead, always just out of reach. They were small, intimate glows, almost candle-like. Yet they moved with intent. Sometimes I thought I caught the outline of someone, or something carrying one, a shape too vague to recognize. I reminded myself to breathe, slow my steps, keep my mind focused on the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. But every step deeper into the forest seemed to pull me into a larger rhythm, an older rhythm, one that didn't belong to me. I came across the first sign of human presence, a clearing littered with old bottles and fragments of glass, remnants of fires long gone cold. There were also markings carved into trees, initials and dates, some recent, some decades old. I traced one with my finger, M.J. 1974, and felt a chill. The forest seemed to hum around me, vibrating softly, as if aware of my curiosity. The lights flickered again, now closer, and I realized they weren't just lanterns. They were signaling, moving with a purpose I couldn't decipher. The more I followed, the more I remembered the darker whispers I had overheard in town. There had been crimes here unsolved, bodies never found, people vanishing without a trace. They said sometimes the forest kept what it took, watching over it, folding it into itself. I didn't want to believe it, but each flicker, each step seemed to tell me otherwise. It was patient, deliberate, guiding me to see what I shouldn't. The fog grew denser, curling around my legs and the roots of the trees. The lights weren't consistent. They blinked in and out, revealing glimpses of shapes that vanished before my mind could process them. Sometimes I thought I saw figures crouching behind trees, standing perfectly still, watching. Their presence was subtle, almost imagined, but my pulse insisted otherwise. Every nerve in my body screamed that I was being observed, that these weren't just lights, not just stories. I stumbled onto another small clearing, barely wider than a room, and froze. The remnants of a fire sat in the center, stones blackened and cracked. Around it, broken glass, a small, rusted tin, and scraps of cloth. I recognized the items from local accounts, the belongings of those who had gone missing, left behind in fragments. And above it all, the lights hovered, flickering just beyond the mist, circling the clearing in an erratic, almost ritualistic pattern. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it, but the forest offered none. The flickering continued, moving with intent, guiding me along a path that no longer seemed natural. I followed, careful, hesitant, aware of every sound, every brush of wind against my arms. The mist parted just enough to reveal glimpses of footprints, too large, too irregular to belong to any human. They led toward the creek, weaving, doubling back, disappearing entirely before reappearing moments later. And as I traced them, I felt the forest tighten around me, shadows stretching longer, twisting in ways that defied logic. I paused to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. The lights flickered closer, closer still, and I thought I heard voices in the wind. Not words, but murmurs, soft fragments of sentences, like a conversation from long ago. The tone was coaxing, patient, but underneath it, I could feel a warning, subtle and deliberate. The forest wasn't merely a place. It was a witness, an archivist of the missing, a keeper of secrets that refused to leave. For a moment, I questioned everything, my senses, my mind, my courage. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps the isolation of the cabin and the day's journey making me imagine things. Yet every step, every glance at the lights, every whisper of wind convinced me that this was real. The forest was alive with memories, patient, deliberate, and watching. I continued along the narrow path that curved around the creek, careful not to lose sight of the flickering. The trees leaned closer now, branches scratching against each other in a rhythm that almost mimicked breathing. The mist thickened, and I had to shine my flashlight to see my own feet. The lights bobbed ahead, sometimes blending with the mist, sometimes flaring against the dark trunks. And then I thought I saw a figure, a shadow, humanoid, elongated, move just beyond the glow. I blinked and it was gone. Only the forest remained, silent, patient, watching. The closer I got to the creek, the more remnants I found. Rusted tins, scraps of clothing, faint depressions in the dirt that suggested someone had sat there, waited, perhaps hoped. I picked up a small, crumpled photograph, water-stained and faded. I could make out a face, smiling, unaware of the fate that might await them here. My stomach twisted. The flickering lights danced again, guiding me past these reminders, past the traces of lives interrupted. toward a bend in the creek where the mist swirled thicker than anywhere else. I hesitated. The lights moved in a deliberate arc, beckoning, leading, insisting I follow. I felt a deep, instinctive fear, but also a strange compulsion. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the forest demanding acknowledgement, dragging me into its history, into its patience. Every rustle, every whisper, every flicker spoke the same message. Observe, remember, respect. The forest doesn't forget. And it does not forgive indifference. By the time I returned to the cabin, hours had passed, or at least it felt that way. The porch light cast long shadows that merged with the forest's edge, and the flickering had disappeared, leaving only darkness and the faint whisper of the creek. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and leaned against the wall, trying to shake off the tension. Sleep would not come easily tonight. And even if it did, I knew the forest would follow me into dreams. I sat in the chair by the window, notebook in hand, trying to write down the sequence of events, the patterns of the lights, the impressions of the forest at night. But words failed me. The forest is patient, deliberate, and it will not reveal itself fully to anyone. I could only hope that the lights had been a warning, a ritual, a message I had partially understood. Yet deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a reminder. Hollow Creek has its secrets, and the forest keeps them. Always for anyone bold or foolish enough to enter. The cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of night when I first noticed it. A door at the far end of the living room. One I hadn't paid attention to earlier. It wasn't unusual for old cabins to have hidden spaces. Small storage closet or cellar doors. But something about this one drew my attention in a way that felt deliberate, almost knowing. I had walked past it several times, glancing briefly, dismissing it. Yet now it seemed impossible to ignore. The wood was aged, dark, and the paint had long since peeled away, revealing the grain beneath. A faint draft escaped through the edges, carrying with it a chill that raised goosebumps on my arms. I knelt, examining the handle. It was cool, metallic, worn from use, but sturdy. I hesitated before turning the knob. A slow tightening in my chest that I couldn't explain. There was a weight to the moment, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. The door creaked open with a long, drawn-out groan, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. I shined my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness to reveal wooden steps slick with age and moisture. A smell hit me immediately. Damp earth, decay. Something metallic, like old blood. I swallowed hard and stepped back, considering whether to go down. But curiosity, that relentless companion, edged out fear. Slowly, carefully, I descended, each step creaking beneath my weight, echoing into the unknown below. The basement opened into a low-ceilinged space, the walls lined with rough, unfinished wood. The air was heavy, stale, carrying the scent of years untouched. Shadows pooled in the corners, deep and unyielding. My flashlight traced the room, illuminating remnants of storage, empty boxes, a rusted metal shelf, and the floor, littered with dirt and small debris. But then I saw it, the walls, scratched and etched with cryptic markings. Some were symbols I didn't recognize. Jagged, deliberate, carved into the wood as if someone had wanted them to remain forever. I crouched to examine them. Letters, numbers, shapes, some repeated, others fragmented, forming sequences that seemed almost like a code. Some were crude, others intricate. I traced one with my finger and felt the splintered wood dig into my skin. A chill ran through me. Whoever had been here had left these marks for a reason, a warning or a message. I could feel their intent lingering, patient and deliberate, as if the cabin had preserved their presence, allowing me to stumble upon it now. I stood, shining the flashlight across the room. The deeper I looked, the more I noticed oddities. Small piles of ash, bits of clothing frayed and tattered, A tin can with something inside, now unrecognizable. I imagined the hands that had left these things, arranging them carefully, marking this place as something significant. The basement felt alive with memory, the residue of whoever had been here before me. And yet, it wasn't just memory. It was waiting. I took a tentative step forward, noticing a small, narrow door along the far wall. It was barely visible, recessed into the wood, almost blending in. My hand hovered over the handle, and I felt my pulse quicken. Something about the basement insisted on patience, on deliberate observation. I turned the knob slowly, and the door opened into a tiny, almost claustrophobic chamber. The air was colder here, heavier. I could hear my own breathing, shallow, echoing faintly off the walls. Inside, the markings became more intense. They covered every surface, overlapping, scribbled with urgency and care. Some were recent, the wood still dark where the scratches had been made. Others older, faded by time. I knelt and examined one carefully, realizing it was a date, recent, from just a few months ago. Someone had been here not long before I arrived. My stomach twisted. Why hadn't anyone noticed? Why had the cabin seemed empty, silent, waiting for me to uncover this? I traced another marking with my finger. A symbol I didn't understand, but it made my skin crawl. The letters and numbers formed patterns that were almost hypnotic, curling across the walls like a warning. I thought of the local stories, the disappearances, the unsolved crimes whispered in hushed tones. Could this basement be connected to them? The realization pressed down on me, heavy and slow. I felt the forest around the cabin, the creek outside, even the walls themselves, as if they were extensions of the same awareness that had been guiding me since I arrived. A sound made me freeze. A soft scrape, faint, coming from deeper in the basement. My flashlight beam wavered as I turned toward it. Nothing, just shadows. Creeping along the walls, my chest tightened. The markings seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. Responding to my presence, I stepped forward cautiously, feeling each footstep echo in the low-ceilinged space. The air was thick, damp, and the smell of metal and decay grew stronger. I noticed a small tin, half buried under debris, and picked it up. Inside were fragments of paper, small scraps with more cryptic writing, symbols, hastily scrawled letters. I could make out bits of words. Don't follow, they wait, Hollow Creek. My hands trembled, and I pressed the flashlight closer to the papers, trying to make sense of them. Each scrap seemed more urgent than the last, as if whoever had written them had been desperate. Desperate to leave a record, a message, for anyone foolish or unlucky enough to enter this basement. The whispers started then, soft, curling around my ears. Not voices, not words, just the sound of breath, of movement, of awareness. I told myself it was my imagination, the weight of the forest and the cabin pressing in on me. Yet the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Every shadow seemed to move in response. Every scratch on the wall seemed alive, reaching for my attention. The basement was a record of presence, of absence, of warning, layered across decades of human interaction with this place. I moved carefully, shining the flashlight across the far wall, and saw something that made me step back. A series of initials, carved deep and fresh, circled by other, older marks. The names were familiar. Those whispered in town, the missing, the lost. I realized then that the basement wasn't just storage, wasn't just a cellar. It was a ledger, a record kept by someone, or something, that had cataloged those who had entered and never left. My heart pounded. The forest outside, the cabin, the creek, they were all connected, in ways I was only beginning to understand. I backed toward the stairs, flashlight scanning every corner. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls. to the scratches shifting, stretching. I could feel the presence of the past residents here, those who had carved and scrawled warnings, and those who had vanished entirely. The air was thick with their memory, their intent, their observation. It was patient, deliberate, and I knew then that I was not alone, not in the way I had thought I was. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing, the basement seemingly reluctant to let me leave. When I reached the living room again, I felt the difference immediately. The cabin was quieter than before, but the weight of the basement lingered. Pressing against my thoughts, I kept the door closed. But I knew it didn't change anything. The marks, the presence, the warning they would follow me. Quietly, relentlessly. Waiting for the next curious visitor to descend the stairs, I sat in the living room, notebook in hand, trying to document everything I had seen, the scratching on the walls, the patterns, the tin, the scraps of paper, all pieces of a puzzle larger than me, older than me. I could feel the tension of the forest outside, the creek murmuring, the wind whispering through the trees. Everything was connected. The cabin, the forest, the people who had disappeared. The basement had shown me just a fragment, enough to understand. Hollow Creek kept its secrets, and it did not forgive curiosity easily. Hours passed. I kept the lamp lit, tracing the patterns in my notebook, occasionally glancing at the basement door. Even through the closed wood, I could feel it, like a pulse, a patient heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Sleep was impossible tonight. Not after seeing what was down there, not after feeling the weight of unseen eyes, not after understanding that the cabin's calm exterior was a mask for something much older, much more deliberate. The forest outside seemed to lean in closer, aware of my every movement. The creek murmuring softly, carrying the echoes of all who had walked this land before me. I could not unsee what I had seen, could not unknowingly leave the messages unobserved. Hollow Creek had demanded attention, and the basement had ensured I understood the cost of ignorance. Even now, in the safety of daylight, I feel it. The basement, the markings, the whispers, they are a part of the cabin and a part of me now. The forest waits, patient and deliberate, for anyone who dares to enter. And I know that next time I will hear more, see more, and understand further the truths that Hollow Creek has always held. In silence, in shadow, in scratches on its walls, I had convinced myself that the basement had been an anomaly. Something hidden, something that needed to be explored and documented, but nothing more. I told myself that once daylight returned, I would laugh at my nerves, at the shadows and scratches, at the remnants of the past that seemed so threatening in the dark. But night has a way of disproving certainty, and Hollow Creek was determined to remind me. It started as a quiet creak, barely audible over the wind whispering through the trees. I was lying on the couch, notebook closed, lamp casting a soft glow, tracing my fingers along the armrest, trying to feel the normalcy of the cabin. The wind outside carried the faint sound of water from the creek, soothing yet eerie, as if the forest was breathing in rhythm with me. Then came the first step, soft, deliberate, moving across the floor above me. I froze, heart catching in my throat. The cabin was small. The only space above me was the loft bedroom, which I knew was empty. I hadn't explored it yet, assuming it was just a storage space. But the sound repeated, a slow, heavy step followed by another, and then another, packing, deliberate, measured. My body tensed, instincts screaming at me to run, to hide, but I was rooted in place, listening. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the old cabin settling, the floorboards shifting under their own age. But the rhythm was wrong, too precise, too consistent. It was deliberate. I told myself it was nothing, that imagination and isolation were playing cruel tricks. But the sound continued, echoing softly yet unmistakably above me. each step pressing into the floor as though testing the boards, marking its presence. I rose slowly, careful not to make a sound of my own. The lamp flickered slightly as I passed it, casting shadows that danced along the walls. I climbed the stairs to the loft, flashlight in hand, each step trembling beneath my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, heavier somehow. Carrying the faint smell of damp earth and metal, the same scent from the basement. I reached the top and paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped. Silence returned, but it was thick, dense, almost expectant. I moved cautiously, scanning the loft with the flashlight. The space was empty, save for dust-covered furniture, an old mattress and cobwebs in the corners. Nothing stirred. I bent down, running my fingers along the floorboards. They were old, warped, but solid. Nothing unusual, yet the impression of presence remained, as though someone or something had just left, lingering in the atmosphere, watching, waiting. I descended carefully, flashlight beam sweeping the living room. The lamp's glow softened the shadows, but I could feel the forest pressing closer through the windows. A presence that wasn't confined to the outside. The trees seemed nearer, their branches scraping against the cabin as though trying to reach inside. The creek's murmur was louder, more insistent, carrying hints of something under its surface, something that had been waiting for nightfall to reveal itself. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but the feeling of being observed persisted, as though the cabin itself was alive, aware of my every move. And then I heard it again, footsteps, lighter this time, moving slowly across the ceiling. Circling, deliberate, my pulse spiked. I gripped the flashlight tighter, shining it at the ceiling. Shadows moved with the beam, though no one was there. The cabin was still, silent, and yet I knew I was not alone. I stood, moving toward the stairs, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The footsteps followed, packing above me, their rhythm hypnotic and unnerving. I tried to call out to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The house seemed to swallow sound, every word absorbed by the thick wooden walls. I whispered to myself, repeating phrases to calm my mind, grounding myself in reality, but the presence above was persistent, patient, deliberate. I thought of the basement again, the markings, the messages left behind. The forest outside, the creek, the cabin itself, they were all connected. Whoever or whatever had left those messages had anticipated arrivals like mine. And now, the footsteps above were their reminder. Nothing in this place is accidental. I was being watched, tested, measured. Every move I made was catalogued, every hesitation noted. The night stretched on, each sound amplified, each shadow a potential threat. The footsteps continued, circling, packing, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I kept my flashlight trained on the ceiling, trying to catch a glimpse of a figure. An anomaly, anything tangible, but the shadows shifted with the light, teasing, elusive, almost playful in their persistence. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying the faint scent of earth and rust, of memory and absence. I considered leaving, fleeing into the night, running through the forest, abandoning the cabin entirely. But the forest would find me. Hollow Creek had a way of ensuring that curiosity carried consequences. And besides, part of me was drawn to understand, to see, to witness the presence that had claimed this cabin and the surrounding woods. I stayed tense and alert, allowing the footsteps to guide the rhythm of my night. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. The wind shifted outside, carrying with it whispers from the trees, soft and indistinct, like voices half remembered from another time. I could feel the weight of history pressing in, the stories of those who had come before me, marked by scratches in the basement, traces left behind, reminders of absence. The footsteps above were part of that history now, a living echo of those who had walked this cabin before. At one point, I must have dozed because I woke to a sudden pause in the rhythm. The footsteps had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed down on the cabin. I lay still, listening, straining to hear the faintest hint of movement. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, branches brushing against the windows, the creek murmuring softly but insistently. I realized then that the footsteps were not just above, they were everywhere. In the air, in the shadows, in the vibrations of the floor. Tying me to the history of Hollow Creek in a way I could not escape. I rose slowly, notebook in hand, trying to record everything. The floorboards creaked beneath me, yet they were nothing compared to the memory of the steps above, echoing in my mind. I wrote fragments, observations, attempts at rational explanation, though each word felt inadequate, insufficient against the weight of presence in the cabin. The forest outside, patient and deliberate, seemed to respond, shifting subtly, emphasizing the isolation, emphasizing the watchfulness. By dawn, the footsteps had ceased, leaving only silence, heavy and watchful. I descended to the living room, flashlight still in hand, and opened the door to the porch. The forest was quiet, the mist curling along the creek, but it felt nearer, alive with memory and intention. I knew that when night returned, the footsteps would resume, and the forest, the cabin, and Hollow Creek itself would continue their slow, deliberate observation. Even as sunlight broke through the trees, I could feel the weight of the night lingering, pressing down on the cabin and my thoughts. Hollow Creek was patient, deliberate, and its watchfulness extended beyond the dark. I would not be alone here again, not truly. The footsteps above, the whispering forest, the memory of those who had disappeared, they were all a part of me now, tethering me to the rhythm of the cabin, to the patience of the woods, to the secrets that Hollow Creek refused to release. And I knew that tonight, and every night after, the footsteps would return, circling, packing, reminding me of what I had learned. That isolation is never complete, that presence persists, and that the forest has always been waiting for someone like me. Morning arrived slowly, muted, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over Hollow Creek. The mist clung stubbornly to the forest floor, curling along the creek, brushing against the edges of the cabin, and even through the thin panes of my windows it seemed to reach inside. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me, the echoes of footsteps and flickering lights lingering like a second skin. Sleep had been minimal. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves outside had kept me on edge. I replayed each sound, each shadow, each fleeting image in my mind, trying to understand what had happened, trying to make it fit within logic. But Hollow Creek does not follow the rules of logic. It follows its own rhythm, its own timeline, and its own memory. And I had been caught within it. I dressed slowly, each motion deliberate, as if rushing might provoke some unseen watcher. The cabin felt different in daylight, smaller, more fragile, yet the shadows of the basement and the loft seemed to linger in corners, stretching longer than they had any reason to. I moved through the rooms quietly, careful not to disturb anything, yet aware that I had already disturbed enough. The forest outside pressed close, the mist swirling around the edges of the porch like a living thing, watching me prepare to leave. I stepped onto the porch, inhaling deeply. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and something older, something metallic and strange. The creek murmured softly in the background, the water moving in a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. I could see the forest more clearly now, the trees tall, imposing, and oddly patient, standing silent sentinels. I felt the eyes of the woods on me, and though there was no movement, no sound, the awareness was undeniable. Packing the car was a slow, careful process. I made sure to leave the cabin as untouched as possible, leaving no trace that I had been there except for my presence in the memories of the space itself. But the weight of what I had experienced lingered with me, pressing into every motion, every glance toward the mist-covered forest. My hands shook slightly as I closed the trunk, the notebook with my notes clutched tightly under my arm. Each step away from the cabin felt like a negotiation with something patient, deliberate, and unyielding. As I turned toward the road, I took one last look at the cabin. It seemed smaller from this distance, nestled among the trees, unremarkable, almost quaint. And yet I knew what lurked beneath, what hid above, what lingered in the corners and the mist. I had walked its floors, traced the scratches in the basement, and felt the presence in the loft. Hollow Creek had left its mark on me, and I could not shake it, no matter how far I drove. The drive back to the main road was slow. The forest pressed close on either side, dense, silent, and occasionally I caught glimpses of the creek winding through the trees like a silver ribbon. The memory of the lights flickering in the mist returned, the whispering of voices carried on the wind, and the steps above me. Each memory pressed on my mind, subtle but insistent, reminding me that I had walked into a place older than reason, older than the town, older than anyone I could ask for explanation. I wondered if what I had experienced was human or something else entirely. The scratches in the basement, the lights at night, the steps in the loft, human hands and feet could not account for everything I had felt. Hollow Creek seemed alive with awareness, patient, deliberate, almost sentient in its observation. And yet, I could not tell whether the forest itself, the cabin, or something unseen had orchestrated the events, guiding me through its hidden story. At the gas station on the outskirts of town, I paused, letting the engine cool. I needed the mundane, the ordinary, to re-anchor myself. People moved around, unaware of the hidden rhythms of the forest I had just left. I bought coffee, stared into the dark liquid, and tried to convince myself that the events of the past night were merely a combination of isolation, imagination, and fear. But the lingering weight in my chest refused to let me believe it fully. Driving away, the trees gradually thinned, and the forest receded, though its impression did not. The creek disappeared from view, but the murmuring remained in my mind, a soft insistence that what I had witnessed was not entirely gone. I thought of the scraps of paper, the symbols, the names etched into the walls, and I realized that Hollow Creek keeps its own ledger, and that every visitor leaves an imprint, whether they are aware of it or not. I passed familiar landmarks, the road slowly returning to what I knew, yet I felt the forest's memory clinging to me. I could almost see the shadows at the edges of my vision, hints of the shapes that had danced just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I knew deep down that the forest had observed me, measured me, and cataloged me alongside those who had disappeared before. And though I had left the cabin physically, I had not left the forest's attention entirely. When I finally reached home, the ordinary world felt jarring, almost alien. The hum of electricity, the warmth of a heated room, the casual chatter of neighbors, all contrasted sharply with the deliberate, patient rhythm of Hollow Creek. I tried to sleep that night, but every shadow in my room seemed to stretch. Every sound in the house was amplified, and I realized that I had brought a fragment of the cabin and the forest with me, carried silently in my mind and in my memory. I do not know if what I experienced was human, or if the forest itself had taken form to teach, to guide, or perhaps to warn. I cannot explain the scratches, the lights, the footsteps, or the sense of awareness that clung to me like a second skin. All I know is that Hollow Creek exists in a way that defies explanation, and that its patient observation does not end with departure. It lingers, quietly, deliberately, and waits for the next visitor to discover its secrets. Even now, I think back to that final morning. The mist curling around the cabin, the air thick with the memory of the night before. I feel the weight of the forest pressing through the daylight, reminding me that isolation is never absolute, that presence persists, and that some places are older than human understanding. Hollow Creek has left its mark, subtle and unyielding, a memory that I carry wherever I go. I cannot tell anyone what I saw, not fully. Words fail to capture the rhythm, the subtlety, the quiet menace of that place. I can only recount fragments, pieces of the experience that feel safe enough to speak aloud. But the full truth, the sense of being watched, of being measured, remains in the marrow of my bones. I left the cabin physically, but Hollow Creek's presence, patient and deliberate, will remain with me indefinitely. I first heard the stories from the old library records, buried in yellowed newspapers and fatting pamphlets, accounts of hikers who vanished without a trace in the forest just beyond town. At first, I dismissed them as local folklore, exaggerated warnings to keep curious visitors away. But the more I read, the more I realized that the stories were not only persistent, they were oddly consistent. Names, dates, locations, and circumstances overlapped, like pieces of a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered, waiting for someone to notice. The forest itself seemed to have a reputation that stretched beyond simple superstition. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, cautioning visitors with phrases like, "Stay on the trails," or "Don't wander when the mist rises." They would glance over their shoulders, as though even mentioning the forest aloud might summon attention from the unseen. I felt a chill each time I listened, a prickle at the back of my neck, yet I was drawn to it, needing to understand why people disappeared here, and why the forest held their secrets so tightly. I began my research by collecting every record I could find. Old newspaper clippings told of hikers who left in the morning and never returned. Search parties combed the trails for days, weeks even, finding only abandoned gear, footprints that led nowhere, and in some cases, eerie remnants of campsites left untouched but oddly arranged. No bodies, no explanations. The official reports were frustratingly sparse, as if those responsible had only cataloged absences rather than seeking answers. The forest seemed to swallow those who entered it, leaving only fragments behind. One case, in particular, haunted me. A young man named Daniel Myers had vanished decades ago. His backpack was found leaning against a tree, untouched, with his journal still inside. The last entry described him noticing a strange pattern of footprints that did not match his own or any animal. He wrote of a whispering sound, subtle, carried by the wind, urging him deeper into the forest. He never returned, and the forest kept its secret. Reading his words sent a shiver down my spine. I could almost hear the rustle of leaves, faint and deliberate, as I imagined the wind guiding him further into the trees. The more I researched, the more I noticed a pattern. Disappearances occurred during certain conditions, foggy mornings, nights with heavy mist, or during storms when the forest seemed to shift and close around anyone walking through it. There was a rhythm to the vanishings, subtle but undeniable. It was as if the forest had its own rules, its own way of observing and deciding who would remain and who would be claimed. I began to feel as though the trees themselves were aware of my presence, their shadows stretching longer in my imagination, their branches whispering faint warnings as I read and reread accounts of those who had gone missing. One evening, I drove to the edge of the forest, parking at the start of the most commonly reported trail. The sun was low, bleeding orange and gold across the treetops, and a soft wind stirred the underbrush. I felt the pull immediately, the quiet expectation of the forest, heavy with the memory of those who had walked its paths and vanished. Footsteps, faint, imagined or real, seemed to follow me as I stepped out of the car. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that the fear was coming from the stories, not the place itself. Yet the hairs on my arms stood on end, and a subtle, persistent feeling told me that the forest was aware of my curiosity, waiting to see if I would step closer. As I moved deeper, I began to notice mementos left behind. A worn boot, laces frayed and dirt caked. A small tin can, rusting and dented, containing scraps of paper. A faded scarf draped over a branch. Each object seemed innocuous at first glance, yet the weight of absence pressed upon them. They were reminders of lives interrupted, of journeys that had ended in silence. I felt the forest watching, guiding, ensuring that every trace left behind spoke to the memory it held. I could almost hear faint whispers as the wind passed through the trees, carrying echoes of those who had walked before me. Following the map, I found markers, stones carefully balanced, sticks tied with frayed string, and carvings on bark that had begun to fade with time. Some were simple shapes, triangles or circles, while others were letters I could not decipher. I traced each with my hand, feeling the texture of the wood and stone, and I imagined the people who had left them, trying to communicate, to survive, or perhaps to warn. The forest itself seemed to amplify their presence, making every shadow deeper, every movement more deliberate. I reached a small clearing, barely visible from the main path, and paused. The map indicated this spot as significant, though it gave no explanation why. I noticed the remains of a campsite, a flattened patch of ground, a rusted kettle, and a journal, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. I lifted the journal gently, careful not to disturb it more than necessary. The entries were brief, fragmented, recounting a journey that had begun with excitement and curiosity, and slowly dissolved into unease. Mentions of whispers, of shapes glimpsed between trees, of feeling watched, mirrored my own sensations in an uncanny way. As I continued along the map's path, the forest grew denser, shadows pooling in corners where the sun barely penetrated. Every step was deliberate. The ground seemed softer here, muffled, absorbing sound. I began to notice footprints, some old, worn, barely discernible, others fresher, almost too precise to be accidental. Each step seemed to guide me further along the map, reinforcing the idea that the forest itself was orchestrating my movements, leading me from one trace to the next, revealing a story only partially told. The trail twisted in ways that seemed unnatural, looping back upon itself, rising and falling in subtle undulations. I noticed more mementos, a small, carved wooden figure leaning against a tree, a frayed backpack strap snared on a branch, a piece of clothing suspended from a bush as if hung for observation. The forest was meticulous in its placement, deliberate in its presentation. Each object spoke of presence and absence simultaneously, marking territory without threat, guiding without explanation. At one point, I paused near a stream, following the map's markings that indicated a bridge that no longer existed. Stones crossed the water, slick and moss-covered, forcing careful steps. As I moved across, I felt the subtle brush of air, a sensation like someone walking behind me, matching my rhythm. I spun quickly, but the forest was empty, silent except for the rush of water. Still, the feeling persisted, the impression that I was being observed, catalogued, measured. The forest remembered every movement, every step, every hesitation. I continued deeper, following the map to a location marked with a series of triangles. The area was heavily overgrown, with vines and ferns obscuring the ground. Here I found the remains of another campsite, a small, rusted pot, a partially collapsed tent, and fragments of a journal written in hurried, anxious handwriting. The entries were brief, repeating the same observations over and over, sounds in the night, shadows that moved just beyond sight, footsteps that circled when no one should have been there. I felt a cold weight in my chest, as though the forest itself was sharing its memory, its lingering presence with me. The light began to fade, and I realized I had been walking for hours. The map had guided me through a network of unofficial trails, each one leaving subtle traces of those who had come before. The forest seemed to shift as I moved, paths narrowing, shadows deepening, branches brushing against me in ways that felt deliberate. I understood then that the map was more than a guide. It was a ledger, documenting the movements of the lost, and ensuring that anyone who followed would sense their presence, however faintly. As I made my way back toward the main trail, I noticed a stone arrangement I had not seen before. Small, carefully balanced, with symbols etched faintly into their surfaces. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the grooves and the care that had gone into their creation. It was a message, though the meaning was lost to time. The forest had preserved it, held it in place, ensuring that someone someday might find it and wonder at its purpose. I left it untouched, understanding that my curiosity was part of the story, and that the forest had always been patient in revealing its secrets. By the time I reached my car, the sun was low, the light filtering through the mist in a soft, muted glow. The forest seemed calmer now, almost indifferent, as though my exploration had been expected, anticipated, and catalogued. I sat in the car for a long while, notebook in hand, documenting the unofficial trails, the markers, the remnants left behind, and the subtle awareness that had followed me through every step. I understood that the forest was patient, deliberate, and unhurried, and that the missing hikers were part of its long memory. Even now, when I look at the map and the notes I've compiled, I can feel the forest watching, the presence lingering in the mist, in the shadows, in the traces left behind. I know that those who vanished are not gone. They remain layered into the very fabric of the forest, their memories preserved in trails, markers, and objects. And I carry that weight with me, aware that curiosity has a price, and that the forest of missing hikers is always patient, always deliberate, and always watching. The first time I sat around a campfire in the heart of the forest, I understood how the missing hikers had been drawn here, how the forest had a way of holding attention, of slowing time, and bending perception. I had ventured back into the area, not following the maps this time, but guided by curiosity and local advice, to meet a few of the old-timers who still remembered stories passed down from hikers and woodsmen long gone. The fire flickered in the gathering dusk, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth, with smoke curling lazily toward the darkening sky. I settled onto a log at the edge of the circle, trying to make myself appear casual, though my mind raced with anticipation. I had listened to the stories in print, traced the unofficial trails, and studied maps, but this was different. Here, I was surrounded by people who had lived alongside the forest, who had felt it shift around them in subtle ways, and who knew, instinctively, the rhythm of its patience. Each one seemed to carry a memory, a weight that made the air heavier, charged with a sense of expectation I could not quite name. The first storyteller was an older man, grizzled and slow of speech, with eyes that seemed to peer past the fire and into the shadows. He spoke of a group of hikers who had camped near the creek decades ago. They had vanished one night, leaving behind tents, cooking gear, and footprints that led to nowhere. The firelight illuminated the lines of his face, and as he spoke, I noticed how his eyes shifted toward the tree line, as if he could sense the forest listening along with us. His voice was calm, measured, and yet every word carried a weight that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "They were careful like you think you are," he said, pausing to toss a stick into the fire. "But the forest, it notices, it has patience, it watches and it waits. You don't see it moving, but it knows every step you take." He leaned back, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees, and I could almost feel his fear, transferred, subtle and insistent, like a pressure against my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just his imagination, just the power of old memories, but the tension in the air was palpable, almost physical. Another local, a woman with hair streaked with silver, began to recount her story. She had been hiking as a teenager when she strayed too far from her friends. The mist had rolled in, thick and sudden, and she had lost the trail entirely. She remembered hearing footsteps behind her, precise and deliberate, though no one was visible. She had run, panic rising in her chest, until she finally stumbled onto a familiar path hours later. The memory made her shiver even now, decades later. "I knew then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the forest wasn't just trees. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake." I listened closely, feeling the pull of the stories, the way each one layered upon the last. There was no supernatural flair, no ghostly figure leaping from the shadows. just the slow, creeping awareness that the forest had a rhythm, a hidden life that humans could never fully understand. And the missing hikers, I realized, were not the result of one mistake or one wrong turn. They were woven into the forest's patient pattern, observed, measured, and absorbed into the quiet memory of the woods. A younger man then spoke, his voice trembling slightly as he recalled the disappearance of a couple he had once camped near. He had been too far away to help when it happened, but he remembered the aftermath. Abandoned tents, a pack of cooking gear left untouched, and strange symbols etched into the bark of trees near the campsite. I don't know who did it, he admitted, or if they were ever human, but I've never felt so small, so insignificant. The forest owns this place. You walk here, and you're just another part of it. His hands shook slightly as he gestured toward the trees, and I felt the truth in his words, a visceral understanding that this forest operated on rules beyond my comprehension. The stories continued, each one darker than the last, though none relied on screams or visible horrors. A group of scouts had vanished, leaving behind only a journal with entries that became increasingly paranoid and fragmented, describing noises in the night, footprints that circled their tents, and shadows that lingered at the periphery of vision. Another tale involved a man who followed a trail off the map and never returned, his car later found parked at the trailhead as if he had never left. Each narrative carried the same undertone, a slow, creeping tension that escalated not through sudden fright, but through relentless observation, the patient insistence of the forest. I felt my own pulse quicken, my chest tightening with a mixture of fear and fascination. I tried to anchor myself in rationality, in logic, but the forest's presence, even at a distance from the campfire, was undeniable. Every rustle of leaves beyond the light's reach, every flicker of shadow seemed to echo the stories being told. The fire warmed my skin, but it could not dispel the sense of being observed, cataloged, measured, a quiet, deliberate pressure that pressed at the edges of perception. The older man added one final story, the one that lingered long after the fire had dimmed. A hiker had followed an unmarked trail, wandering deeper than anyone should have dared. He wrote in a journal that the trees seemed to shift around him, guiding him off course, whispering in the wind with voices that were almost human. Days later, his friends found his backpack and journal, but nothing more. The entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, leaving only the sense of his presence absorbed into the forest itself. The man's eyes met mine as he finished speaking, and I understood, suddenly, that these stories were not merely tales. They were lessons, warnings, and memories encoded in the patient observation of the forest. As the night deepened, the fire's warmth became a thin barrier between the living and the forest. The locals began to pack up, the air cooling rapidly, leaving a thin mist curling around the logs and rocks where we had sat. I lingered for a moment, gazing into the shadows beyond the circle of light. The forest seemed to breathe, patient, deliberate, and utterly indifferent to my presence. I could almost feel it nodding my footsteps, cataloging my curiosity, and I understood then that curiosity itself was a fragile thing here, tempting, but not without consequence. I walked back to my car slowly, the ground damp and uneven beneath my boots. Every branch seemed to lean closer. Every rustle of leaves felt like a whispered reminder that the forest remembered. I imagined the missing hikers, layered into the undergrowth, their presence folded into the rhythm of the trees, waiting for anyone who dared to enter and pay attention. I realized then that the forest was not just a place. It was a keeper of stories, of movements, of absence and presence, patient in its insistence that those who ventured too far would carry its memory, willingly or not. Driving away, the campfire's light fading behind me, I felt the weight of the stories pressing down. The forest seemed smaller from the road, yet more imposing, as though it had drawn back to observe me, marking me in its quiet ledger. The tales I had heard were not just entertainment, they were warnings, lessons written in memory, air, and shadow. I could feel the forest's awareness lingering with me, subtle, deliberate, almost like a pulse beneath the skin. Even now, I recall each tale, each whisper, each moment around that campfire. I feel the forest's quiet gaze, the faint echo of footsteps in the mist, and the unyielding patience of the trees. The missing hikers are never gone. They remain part of the forest's rhythm, observed and remembered, and I understand that anyone who sits quietly and listens like I did becomes part of that rhythm as well. The stories ended, but their weight did not. The forest had shared its lessons with me, patient, deliberate, and quietly insistent. Curiosity is noted, presence is measured, and absence is remembered. I carried the campfire stories home, tucked into my mind alongside the maps and mementos, aware that the forest's observation does not end when the light fades or the fire dies. Its memory is long and it is patient. Dusk settled over the forest like a slow tide, stretching shadows across the trails I had begun to memorize. The day had faded, leaving only a faint orange glow behind the distant hills, and I knew that once darkness fully claimed the woods, the forest would feel alive in ways I could not see, only sense. I had prepared for this walk, carrying a flashlight, a notebook, and an uneasy curiosity that pressed against my chest like the weight of unseen eyes. The trail I followed was one of the older paths, unmarked on any modern map, its edges blurred by undergrowth and fallen leaves. I stepped carefully, noting depressions in the soil where shoes had passed decades ago, some recent, others weathered and faint. Each footprint told a story, a lingering echo of someone who had walked here and vanished. The forest seemed to respond, branches brushing against each other in subtle murmurs, as though whispering reminders that I was never truly alone. I spotted the remnants of a campsite almost immediately, a flattened patch of ground with a rusted pot lying on its side. The smell of moss and damp earth was strong, pressing into my senses, mingling with the faint tang of smoke from a fire long extinguished. A tattered journal lay half buried under leaves. I brushed it gently, its pages brittle, and read fragments of an entry. The trees, they shift when I'm not looking. Footsteps follow even when I stop. I feel them counting each step. The words resonated in my mind, a slow thrum of tension that built with each passing moment. As I moved deeper, the forest thickened, the canopy swallowing the remaining light. Shadows pooled beneath the trees, stretching unnaturally, and the air grew cooler, damp with the lingering mist that settled between trunks. I heard the rustle of leaves, soft and deliberate, not aligned with the wind. My heartbeat quickened, but I forced myself to continue, noting every subtle shift in the ground and every trace of those who had come before. Each mark, an abandoned boot, a frayed piece of rope, a carved initial, seemed to pulse with the memory of absence. The trail twisted in ways that challenged my memory. A familiar fork now appeared unfamiliar. A fallen tree that had once blocked the path was gone, replaced by thick undergrowth. I realized then that the forest was not static. It was patient, deliberate, reshaping itself in subtle ways, ensuring that anyone who wandered through felt the presence of its history. My mind tried to rationalize it, telling me the changes were natural, seasonal, nothing more. But instinct told me otherwise. The forest remembered, and it responded to presence. I came to a creek I recognized from previous maps, its water murmuring softly as it traced a winding course through the trees. Stones formed a crossing, slick and moss-covered, demanding careful steps. I paused, listening. The sound of water masked almost everything, yet I felt it. The subtle shift in the air, the almost imperceptible brush of movement at the edge of my vision. I spun, flashlight sweeping through the mist, but the forest offered nothing. Still, I could feel it nodding me, cataloging me like the missing hikers before me. Further along, I discovered a series of markers I had not seen on previous walks. A triangle carved into bark, a small pile of stones balanced precariously, a frayed scarf snagged on a branch. Each was deliberate, arranged with care, signaling something I could not fully understand. I traced the carvings with my fingers, feeling the grooves and the age of the marks. The forest seemed to lean closer, to observe my attention, responding to my curiosity in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. A hollow in the base of a tree caught my eye, small and dark, almost hidden by ivy. Inside was a small trinket, a carved figure weathered by time. I picked it up, feeling the smooth edges, and realized it had been left by someone who had passed this way long ago. Another hiker, another story, another presence absorbed into the forest's memory. The weight of countless absences pressed against me, a slow, creeping unease that wrapped around my chest like ivy itself. The light was fading rapidly now, and I realized the trail I had followed for hours had led me farther into the woods than I had intended. The trees pressed closer, their trunks appearing unnaturally thick, their branches intertwining overhead to form a near-solid ceiling that swallowed what little light remained. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant bird calls, felt deliberate, precise, almost like a language I could not comprehend. I tried to remind myself of reason, of the countless logical explanations, yet my instincts whispered otherwise. I was being observed, measured, noted. At one point, I stumbled across a backpack, frayed and partially buried in the undergrowth. The straps were torn and the fabric was faded with exposure to rain and sun. I hesitated before touching it, sensing the stories it held, the person who had left it here, the choices they had made, the path that had ended abruptly. I imagined them walking, unaware of the forest's patient gaze, footsteps followed by silence, disappearing without a trace. The idea made my stomach tighten, a cold knot of unease settling deep within. I followed the trail until I reached a small clearing, where the remains of a fire pit suggested someone had spent a night here, or perhaps several nights long ago. Stones were arranged meticulously around the pit, and I noticed faint symbols scratched into the bark of surrounding trees. The shapes were simple, triangles, circles, and lines, but their repetition felt intentional, almost ritualistic. I traced them lightly with my fingers, and a chill ran down my spine as I imagined the hands that had made them. Hands guided by fear, desperation, or something stranger, something beyond explanation. The forest had a rhythm, and I could feel it as I moved through the clearing. Every step I took was mirrored by the shadows, every pause noted, every glance recorded. The absence of people made the presence of the forest itself more intense, more tangible. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, punctuated only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves that seemed to follow me, echoing the footsteps of the missing. As darkness fell completely, the forest became a living thing in my mind. Shapes formed and dissolved at the edge of vision, shadows stretching unnaturally, and every sound felt amplified by the weight of memory and absence. I realized that the missing hikers were everywhere, layered into the soil, the trees, the mist itself. Their traces guided me, warned me, and reminded me that the forest does not forget. I was aware, finally, that I was part of that rhythm now, cataloged, observed, and noted. I made my way back along the trail, careful not to disturb any markers, footprints, or remnants of those who had come before. The forest seemed to pulse with quiet energy, deliberate, patient, and entirely indifferent to my presence. Each step brought both relief and tension, the knowledge that I was leaving, but only temporarily. The forest would remember me as it remembered all who ventured too far, who observed too closely, who listened too intently. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, where the last light of dusk lingered in the sky, I felt a profound sense of both relief and unease. I had walked trails that no one else dared, followed paths marked by absence and memory, and felt the subtle gaze of the forest pressing against the back of my mind. I knew I had experienced something few could comprehend, a quiet but insistent awareness that lingered long after I left its edges. Even now, when I think back to that evening, I can feel the pressure of the forest, the weight of footprints, markers, and the slow rhythm of absence. I know that the missing hikers remain layered into the very fabric of the woods, their presence absorbed into the soil, the trees, and the mist. And I carry that knowledge with me, patient, deliberate, and quietly insistent. The forest of missing hikers never forgets, and it never truly releases those who walk its trails. I had returned to the forest of missing hikers one last time, though part of me wished I hadn't. The memories of footprints, abandoned campsites, and campfire stories lingered in my mind, curling into a quiet anxiety I could not shake. Dusk approached as I parked my car near the edge of the forest, the light fading behind the hills. The air was cool, damp with the faint smell of pine and wet earth, and the forest seemed to exhale, as though sensing my arrival, acknowledging my presence. I began along a familiar path, one I had traced before, lined with thick undergrowth and ancient trees whose roots twisted like veins across the ground. At first, everything seemed as I remembered. Familiar bends, the creek murmuring nearby, and remnants of markers left behind by hikers long gone. But as I continued, a subtle shift occurred. Trails that should have been straightforward twisted unexpectedly, loops forming that I did not recall. I glanced around, noting the positions of trees, the arrangement of rocks, and realized with unease that nothing in this section of the forest matched my memory. The path seemed to loop back on itself, though I could not recall taking any turns. I walked carefully, my steps deliberate, ears straining for any sign of other presence, any snap of twig or rustle of leaves that might explain the sensation pressing against my awareness. But the forest was silent, patient, deliberate. Each bend in the trail brought familiar sights in unfamiliar arrangements, and a creeping dread settled into my chest. I felt watched, not in a sudden, violent way, but with the slow, unyielding attention of a predator who had all the time in the world. I found an old campsite that I knew had been near a small clearing, but it appeared further along the trail than it should have been. The fire pit was stone-lined as I remembered, but the objects surrounding it were subtly different. A rusted pot lay inverted, a tattered journal that I did not recognize peeked from under a branch. I knelt to examine it, flipping through pages that were filled with fragmentary notes, sketches of trails and symbols I could not decipher. The handwriting was hurried, anxious, the thoughts of someone lost, someone who had felt the forest watching. Reading the words, I felt an uncanny resonance with my own experience, the same tension, the same creeping awareness of being observed. I stood and continued along the trail, now acutely aware of how the paths looped and twisted unnaturally. I thought I recognized one fork, only to find it leading me back to a spot I had passed moments ago. Each time I corrected my course, the forest seemed to adjust in response. Branches leaned differently, shadows stretched into places they should not have reached, and the wind carried sounds that seemed deliberately placed, rustling leaves, faint footsteps, whispers of movement that never materialized. I could feel the weight of history pressing against me, the presence of the missing hikers layered invisibly into the trails themselves. A small, abandoned trinket caught my eye, a carved figure darkened by age, wedged into the fork of a tree. I picked it up, examining the delicate grooves and the faint traces of paint that remained. It was as if someone had left it intentionally for me to find, a signal embedded into the forest's memory, reminding me that I was not the first, and certainly not the last, to walk these trails. The forest seemed to pulse with subtle energy, deliberate and patient, and I understood that every step I took was recorded in the quiet ledger it maintained. I walked on, the light fading quickly now, leaving the woods cloaked in shadow. Each turn seemed to change subtly as I approached, making familiar landmarks appear in unfamiliar configurations. I realized with a chill that the forest was reshaping itself around me, guiding me along paths that existed only temporarily, rearranging to obscure the past and disorient anyone who dared venture deeper. The sense of being watched grew stronger, the pressure more insistent, and I understood that this was the forest's design, a living memory, patient and precise, ensuring that its history could not be easily unraveled. At one point, I came upon a shallow depression in the soil, circular and deliberate, like a makeshift shelter had been here long ago. I knelt to examine it, brushing aside leaves and debris, and discovered small fragments of a notebook charred and water-stained. The words were mostly illegible, but a few phrases survived. They follow. I cannot find the path. It is patient, it watches. My chest tightened as I read them, recognizing in those words the same dread I had felt since entering the forest. This place had a way of preserving presence, of making sure absence was never forgotten. I moved further, following what I thought was a straight path, only to find myself back at the edge of the same clearing I had passed an hour before. Panic threatened to rise in me, but I forced calm, reminding myself that perception can deceive, that exhaustion can warp memory. Still, the loops were too precise, the repetitions too deliberate, the feeling of observation too insistent. The forest had its own intelligence, patient and deliberate, moving the trails, guiding the curious along circuits that had no true beginning or end. Faint markers appeared along the way. A small pile of stones, sticks arranged in careful patterns, initials carved into bark, and remnants of shoes and fabric. I recognized some, though others were unfamiliar, yet all carried the same weight of absence. It was as if every missing hiker had contributed to this network, leaving subtle traces, recording their existence in objects and arrangements that would endure far beyond their presence. The forest was not just a backdrop. It was a repository of memory, meticulous and patient, observing anyone who entered. The last light of dusk faded entirely, leaving me in near darkness, save for the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dense shadows. Every movement of leaves, every subtle shift in shadow, felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was aware of my attention and adjusting in response. I began to understand why hikers disappeared, why footprints ended abruptly, why tents were found abandoned. The forest was not malevolent, not in the sense of cruelty, but it was indifferent, patient, and infinitely observant. Those who walked its paths became part of its memory, cataloged, preserved, and quietly absorbed. I followed the trail until I found a familiar clearing, where the remnants of another campsite lay half buried. I recognized the patterns of objects left behind, stones balanced carefully, a rusted pot, and a journal whose pages had begun to curl. I knelt to read a few fragments, noting the anxiety and fear in the handwriting, the meticulous observations of shadows and sounds, and the repeated concern of being followed. My heartbeat quickened, the tension in my chest like a physical presence. I understood that these people, though gone, still had a voice here, recorded in every marker, every object, every subtle shift of the forest itself. As I made my way back toward the forest's edge, I noticed the subtle distortions of the trail once again. Paths that should have been straight curved subtly, landmarks appeared in different arrangements, and shadows stretched unnaturally. I realized then that the forest was patient in its memory, meticulous in its design, ensuring that anyone who entered would leave changed, aware, and recorded. The missing hikers were everywhere, layered invisibly into the ground, trees, and mist, and I carried the weight of their presence as I emerged from the woods. Once I reached the edge, the lights of the nearby road cutting through the dark, the air felt less oppressive, yet I could still sense the lingering observation, a quiet insistence that the forest remembered me. Every step back to my car was deliberate, careful, my mind cataloging the loops and rearrangements, aware that this place was patient, deliberate, and indifferent. The trails had disappeared behind me in the sense that I could not trace them exactly again. Yet the memory of them, and of those who had walked them before me, remained imprinted in my mind. Even now I think of that night, the loops, the markers, the subtle rearrangements, and the quiet, observing presence of the forest. I know that the missing hikers have become part of it, and anyone who ventures along its trails, guided by curiosity or obsession, will be woven into its patient memory. The paths may vanish, the objects may decay, but the forest observation is unending, deliberate, and quietly insistent, leaving behind a lingering fear that cannot be erased. I first spotted the ranger station from the edge of the clearing, half hidden by overgrown brush and leaning ever so slightly to one side, as if it had given up decades ago. The paint had peeled in long strips, revealing gray wood beneath, weathered and splintered by years of rain, wind, and neglect. A sagging roof threatened to collapse at any moment, yet the structure stood stubbornly, silent and unmoving. The forest around it was alive with the gentle hum of evening, leaves rustling, birds settling in branches, but the station itself seemed apart, a quiet monument to absence. Curiosity drew me closer, my footsteps soft against the carpet of moss and fallen leaves. I had read about this place in local archives, sealed for decades after the ranger in charge had vanished without a trace. Stories swirled about sudden disappearances, strange sounds at night, and reports of hikers hearing someone or something moving within the building long after it was supposedly abandoned. My rational mind tried to dismiss it. Buildings decay, trees fall, people leave. But every instinct in me whispered that there was more here than just wood and nails. The front door was the first obstacle. Rust had claimed the lock, but not completely. It resisted my push and pull, squeaking like a trapped animal, and I imagined the decades it had spent untouched, quietly holding its secrets behind the thin barrier of splintered wood. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any sound inside. Nothing. The silence was thick, almost tangible, and I felt the first prickling of unease. Still, the pull of curiosity outweighed fear, and I circled the station, searching for another way in. Windows lined the front, but most were boarded or broken, the glass either absent or jagged. I crouched beside one, peering in through the fractured pane. Dust motes danced in the fatting light, stirred by the faintest drafts, and the interior appeared frozen in time. A desk leaned against a wall, papers yellowed and curling, a chair overturned, and shelves lined with jars and maps coated in dust. The floorboards creaked softly as if they remembered the weight of past footsteps. I had no right to enter, and yet the temptation was unbearable. I circled the building again, knotting the back door. Rusted hinges, warped wood, and a lock fused with age, but not insurmountable. I tested it gently, hearing the groan of resistance as I applied pressure. Something shifted inside the building. A subtle movement, perhaps just the wind, perhaps something else. My pulse quickened, every nerve on edge, but the rational part of my brain insisted it was imagination. Yet I could not ignore the sensation of being watched, of something observing me from within those darkened rooms. From the edge of the clearing, the forest seemed to lean closer, trees stretching over the roof of the station, casting elongated shadows that twined like fingers across the walls. The air smelled damp and earthy, mingled with the faint trace of old pine and rotting wood. I crouched lower, pressing my hands against the weathered siding, feeling the vibration of the building beneath my fingertips, a subtle hum that might have been caused by settling timber or something else entirely. It was a quiet reminder that the station had been here long before me and would remain long after, guarding its secrets patiently. I traced my fingers along the cracks in the wood, knotting scratches, weathering patterns and faded numbers carved into the frame. Someone, or something, had left marks long ago, now barely legible. I imagined the hands that had made them, reaching in desperation or warning, the stories embedded into the grain of the building. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized how many unknown lives had intersected with this place, each leaving a faint imprint that lingered invisibly in the air. The sun dipped lower, casting the forest into shades of gray and gold. The shadows inside the windows stretched unnaturally, reaching outward like dark fingers seeking the clearing. I stepped back instinctively, yet my attention was glued to the building. I imagined the ranger decades ago, walking these floors, cataloging the trails, noting the hikers, perhaps sensing the first subtle stirrings of something not quite human. And then, in a moment of cold realization, he was gone. No trace. No explanation. Just absence, preserved in this building like a silent witness. I crouched again by the broken window, trying to catch a better glimpse of the interior. Dust covered everything, yet certain objects seemed almost untouched, as though placed deliberately to be noticed by someone curious enough to come close. An old lantern, a map pinned crookedly on the wall, a journal resting on the desk, pages yellowed but intact. I could not read them from my angle, but I could sense their presence, a quiet, lingering story waiting to be uncovered. The forest seemed to press closer, quieting the rustle of leaves, amplifying the silence of the station itself. A breeze stirred, and I thought I heard a faint creak from inside, though it could have been the shifting of timber, the settling of decades-old boards. Still, I froze, aware that my own breathing sounded loud in the stillness. The station seemed alive with memory, patient and deliberate, absorbing my attention and testing my resolve. I imagined stepping inside, feeling the dust under my feet, brushing against objects that had been untouched for decades. But the thought carried weight, a quiet fear of what might still linger in the shadows. I walked slowly around the perimeter one last time, examining the exterior. The roof sagged further in places, shingles missing, the timbers groaning faintly under their own age. Vines had crept up the walls, twisting into the cracks, and moss claimed the lower sections like a slow, silent invasion. The forest itself seemed to conspire with the station, wrapping around it, guarding it, ensuring that curiosity came at a measured cost. Every step I took was deliberate, aware that I was part of the rhythm of this place, another observer in a long line of intrusions. By the time the sun fully dipped behind the hills, the station was cloaked in shadows. The forest's evening sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant calls of nocturnal birds seemed to merge with the building's quiet presence. I stood still for a long time, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me, aware that curiosity had brought me here, but that understanding the full truth might be impossible. The building had watched, waited, and endured, silent and resolute. I realized that even the attempt to observe it fully might be futile. The station was older than my questions, patient beyond my comprehension, and uninterested in immediate answers. Reluctantly, I stepped back from the edge of the clearing, taking one last look at the ranger station. Its windows reflected the faint light of dusk, empty yet heavy with presence. The forest embraced it, shadows stretching long, and I felt the pull of its history tugging at me, a quiet insistence that some doors, some places, remain locked for a reason. I could not enter, not fully, but the curiosity remained, lodged like a quiet seed in my mind, waiting for another visit, another observer, another moment when patience and recklessness might collide. And so I left, my steps slow and deliberate, tracing the path back to the road. The forest seemed unchanged, yet subtly aware of my departure, carrying the memory of my presence alongside countless others who had walked its edges. The ranger station remained behind, patient, silent, enduring, guarding its secrets as it had for decades, untouched yet entirely alive in its quiet, deliberate way. I knew I would not forget it, nor would I escape the lingering sense that some doors, once noticed, can never be truly unseen. I returned to the ranger station the following evening, drawn by a curiosity I could not quite explain. The forest had already begun its nightly transformation, the light dimmed, shadows stretching long and thin across the undergrowth, while the air cooled and thickened with the scent of wet leaves and pine. My footsteps on the carpet of moss were careful, deliberate, almost reverent. I could feel the station ahead, silent and patient, like a sentinel guarding its secrets. The door resisted me as before, the rusted hinges groaning with faint protest. I pressed my palm against the warped wood, feeling the subtle vibration of the structure beneath me. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with the scent of decay and age. Dust motes danced in the weak glow of my flashlight, each one a tiny witness to the years that had passed in silence. I stepped in slowly, letting my eyes adjust, and the shadows of furniture and objects took shape in the dim light, frozen mid-motion as if time itself had paused. I moved toward the desk that had caught my attention before. On its surface lay a scattering of old ranger logs, some open as if waiting for someone to read, others stacked neatly, yellowed with age. I knelt, my fingers brushing over the papers, and felt the strange weight of history pressing down on me. Each page contained detailed entries, dates, names, and meticulous observations of trails, hikers, and the subtle, almost imperceptible strangeness of the forest. One entry caught my eye. The handwriting was precise, almost clinical, yet beneath it lay a thread of tension, a human awareness of the forest's unpredictable nature. It described hikers who had vanished without a trace, their last known paths carefully recorded. Some were simple missteps, notes suggested. Others were inexplicable, entries marked with question marks and repeated reminders. Paths changed overnight. Trails do not lead where expected. I ran my finger along the words, feeling the same unease I had experienced walking the trails myself. The forest was patient, deliberate, and it had been observing long before I had arrived. Another log detailed sightings of something, or someone, moving just beyond the tree line. The descriptions were fragmented, hesitant. Shadows too long, movements against wind, eyes. I cannot be sure, they follow quietly. Reading these entries, I felt the hairs on my arms rise. It wasn't that I believed in monsters, not in the fairy tale sense. It was something subtler, an intelligence woven into the trees, into the forest itself, patient and slow, keeping careful watch on anyone who ventured too deep. I turned to another page, one dated decades earlier, and the weight of absence hit me. The ranger who had written it had chronicled missing hikers, each one a careful study of movements, habits, and last known locations. Names I had heard in local legends appeared here, detailed with a painstaking accuracy that made the disappearances feel even more tangible. There was no panic in the writing, just observation and a quiet dread, a realization that some forces in this forest were beyond understanding. The room seemed to grow colder, or perhaps I had simply noticed it as my focus tightened. Shadows shifted across the walls, subtle and imperceptible, yet unmistakable. I felt a presence, not immediate or threatening, but patient, as though the forest itself was watching through the structure, ensuring that my attention remained tethered to its history. My flashlight flickered slightly, and for a heartbeat, I imagined the faint outline of someone or something, just beyond the desk, observing. I told myself it was imagination. The logs themselves could make any place feel haunted. The words carried the weight of countless absences. I continued reading, noting the consistency in descriptions over decades. Hikers who had wandered off trails, trails that changed configuration overnight, sounds of movement in empty spaces, objects rearranged when no one was near. I felt a chill run through me as I realized the forest's history was embedded in the logs. Every missing hiker, every strange observation, every inexplicable event was recorded meticulously, preserved in these yellowed pages. The forest had a memory far longer than any human could possess. A sudden creak from the ceiling made me glance up, though I could see nothing. The air felt heavier, thick with expectation. I thought about the ranger who had last walked these halls, about the entries ending abruptly, about the unanswered questions and the missing people. I ran my fingers over a map tucked among the logs, noting the handwritten trails, unofficial paths, and small symbols indicating sightings or odd events. Some trails looped impossibly, others seemed to vanish altogether. The forest, it seemed, had its own design, and these logs were its quiet testament. I paused, letting the silence fill me, listening to the faint sounds of the forest outside, the wind brushing against the canopy, leaves rustling in patterns that felt deliberate. The station felt alive in its own way, a repository of observation, patience, and subtle warning. Each page I turned carried a whisper of those who had walked these paths, observed the shadows, and felt the pressure of something unseen. It was not the kind of fear that made your heart race with sudden jolts. It was the slow, insistent tightening in the chest, the creeping awareness that the forest had its own consciousness, and it remembered. I found an entry marked with red pencil, a note scrawled across the margins. They follow at their own pace, never leave a trace, always present. I read it several times, tracing the lines with my eyes, feeling the dread of patient observation sink deeper. The forest did not act violently, did not chase. It merely waited, preserved, and recorded, ensuring that anyone who entered became part of its memory. The missing hikers were not gone. Not entirely. Their presence lingered in the soil, in the air, and in these logs, layered into the architecture of the station itself. Hours passed, though I could not say exactly how long. I read through more logs, absorbing descriptions of sounds in the forest, rearranged objects, sightings at dusk, and subtle movements too fleeting to capture fully. Each story echoed the one before it, creating a mosaic of experiences, a subtle map of absence and lingering awareness. I began to understand the forest and the station as a single entity, intertwined, observing, documenting, and quietly asserting control over the stories it held. When I finally set the logs aside, I felt the weight of the forest's memory pressing upon me. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper, and the quiet presence of the station more pronounced. I realized that I had come seeking stories, explanations, or maybe just adventure, but what I found was something far more enduring: the patient, deliberate observation of a place that recorded everyone who crossed its threshold. The logs were not merely pages. They were vessels of memory, echoing with absence, with observation, with the slow, creeping dread of being watched. I left the station as night fully claimed the forest, stepping carefully through the clearing. The air was cool against my skin, the forest quiet, yet the sensation of eyes, patient and distant, followed me. The ranger station stood behind me, silent, enduring, filled with the meticulous memory of decades. I knew that anyone who entered these woods, who ventured near the station, would become part of the archive, their presence absorbed and recorded, layered into the quiet, deliberate consciousness of the forest. Even now I can feel it, the weight of those logs, the echoes of footsteps long gone, the subtle rearrangement of paths and shadows. The forest is patient, indifferent, and infinitely observant. It does not need to chase. It does not need to frighten. It simply waits, preserving its history, and ensuring that anyone who notices, anyone who comes close, carries a trace of it with them forever. The night settled around the ranger station like a heavy blanket, and I felt the forest shift subtly as I moved through the clearing. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, and every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. I had lingered longer than I intended inside the station, absorbed by the old logs and maps, the meticulous observations of missing hikers and strange occurrences. Now, as darkness fully claimed the woods, I sensed that the station itself had grown aware of my presence, or perhaps I was simply more aware of the forest's subtle, patient observation. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking faintly beneath my weight. A gentle wind rustled through the trees, carrying sounds that at first seemed ordinary. A branch snapping, leaves brushing against one another, the distant cry of a nocturnal bird. But as I paused and listened, the rhythm of the forest began to feel deliberate, almost choreographed. Footsteps. No, too irregular, too soft, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. Something moved just beyond the clearing, slow, cautious, deliberate. My heart thumped quietly, a reminder to stay calm, to observe rather than panic. I scanned the shadows with my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness in narrow, trembling swaths. The trees swayed gently, and every movement seemed charged, alive. I told myself it was my imagination, a mind stretched thin by the isolation and the stories I had absorbed from the ranger logs. But then I caught a flicker at the edge of the light, something small, perhaps a branch, perhaps something else. It vanished before I could focus on it, leaving a chill curling through my chest. I retreated inside, shutting the door quietly behind me, but the sensation did not fade. The station felt alive in its own way, a silent witness, patient and deliberate, observing my every movement. Shadows danced along the walls in the glow of my flashlight, exaggerated and elongated, and I felt as if eyes followed me wherever I turned. I tried to focus on the objects around me: the overturned chair, the stacks of yellowed maps, the scattered ranger logs. Everything was ordinary, yet charged with memory. with the presence of those who had been here before me, and with the faint suggestion that I was not entirely alone. I sat at the desk, flipping through a log that had not yet been fully explored. The entries were meticulous, noting the smallest details of hiker behavior, forest phenomena, and strange disturbances that defied explanation. One passage mentioned unseen watchers, noting a sensation of being followed, of eyes in the dark, and the unease it caused even among experienced rangers. I read the words slowly, letting the rhythm of their observations sink in, feeling the same subtle dread settle into my chest. The forest outside seemed to pulse in time with the entries, each whisper of wind or rustle of leaves echoing the tension recorded decades ago. A sudden sound outside made me freeze. A branch snapping, perhaps a deer. Yet the timing was too deliberate, the sound too close, too deliberate in its pause. I held my breath, listening, straining my ears to discern any pattern. Another sound, soft and hesitant, this time to my left. Footsteps. Movement through underbrush. My flashlight hovered over the window, casting a narrow beam into the darkness, but revealed nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the gentle sway of foliage. Still, the feeling persisted. I was being observed, carefully, quietly, and the forest, patient and deliberate, allowed me to notice. I rose slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and careful, and approached another window. The glass was cracked in places, fogged with condensation, distorting the view. My own reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and tense. Beyond the glass, shapes shifted, subtle and slow. Branches, perhaps, yet they seemed to move with intention, leaning just so, swaying against the wind's rhythm. I tried to dismiss it, focusing on the interior, on the safety of the station's walls. But the feeling of observation did not fade. It grew, insistent, subtle, crawling into the corners of my mind. I moved back to the desk, the ranger log spread before me. I read passages describing hikers noticing faint figures in the distance, shadows that seemed to follow, but disappeared whenever approached. Some rangers had called them imagination. Others documented the sensations with painstaking care. The consistency across decades was unsettling. The forest itself seemed to preserve and repeat the experiences of those who entered, ensuring that every observer became part of the ongoing narrative of the woods. I could feel it now, threaded through the air, a slow, deliberate presence that made my skin tingle. A low wind gust rattled the window pane, and I flinched, imagining the slightest figure moving beyond the glass. I told myself it was just wind. The shadows were just shadows. Yet every instinct in me screamed otherwise, a quiet voice whispering that the forest's memory extended into the present, that the watchers noted my arrival, my curiosity, and my hesitation. I imagined eyes, patient and still, following me, noting each motion, preserving it alongside all those who had come before. The night deepened. The wind softened, leaving only the subtle rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the station itself. Yet the feeling of observation never left. I glanced at a journal lying open on the desk, pages filled with careful notes about sounds, shadows, and fleeting glimpses of movement in the dark. Each entry was an echo of the experiences I now had myself. The subtle dread, the faint noises, the sense that the forest was aware, deliberate, and patient. I read each line slowly, letting the rhythm of observation sink in, feeling the forest's consciousness threading through the decades into my own nervous awareness. Hours seemed to pass in quiet tension. I made my way through the interior, checking windows, scanning the room, listening to the faint symphony of the forest at night. Each step carried weight, the floorboards creaking in soft protest. Shadows shifted just slightly at the edge of vision, and I flinched, convinced that something moved with intention beyond the glass. It did not chase. It did not approach. It merely waited, persistent, patient, and unrelenting in its quiet presence. At one point, I thought I saw a figure move past the edge of a window, slender, humanoid, but impossibly still in movement. My heart leapt, yet when I focused there was nothing. Just the forest, patient and deliberate, pressing against the walls, preserving the memory of all who had come before. I realized then that the forest was not trying to harm, not in the conventional sense. It simply observed, recorded, and remembered, threading each presence into the ongoing story of the woods and the station. I returned to the desk, sitting heavily in the creaking chair. The shadows of the room, cast by my flashlight, seemed longer now, stretching across walls and floor in slow, deliberate arcs. The faint noises continued outside, irregular, patient, deliberate, echoing the experiences chronicled in the logs. The forest remembered every sound, every shift in light, every presence that passed through its paths. And now I was part of it. A quiet, reluctant addition to the memory held by trees, leaves, and shadows. Time became difficult to measure. The night outside deepened, yet inside the station, the forest's patient observation continued, subtle, deliberate, unrelenting. I could feel the history of the place, of every missing hiker, every subtle shadow, every unexplained noise, threading into my consciousness. The sensation was not violent, not immediate. It was insistent, slow, a quiet weight that settled in the chest and did not lift. I understood then why rangers had chronicled every detail, every observation. The forest's memory was infinite, and those who noticed it became part of the record. Eventually, I stepped back from the desk, brushing dust from my hands, aware that the night had fully enveloped the clearing. The forest beyond the windows was silent now, yet the feeling of being watched lingered. I imagined the observers, shadows, branches, subtle movements, tracking me, cataloging me, preserving my presence alongside the long history of absences. The ranger station itself seemed aware, a quiet guardian of this knowledge, patient and deliberate. I realized I would carry this awareness with me, a lingering sensation of observation that could not be fully explained or ignored. When I finally left the station, stepping carefully into the clearing, the forest seemed to press closer, shadows stretching long and deliberate across the moss and undergrowth. My footsteps echoed softly, yet I could feel the presence of the woods threaded through every sound, every movement. I glanced back at the ranger station, its windows reflecting nothing but darkness, yet heavy with memory. I understood then that the forest does not need to show itself fully to be known. It merely observes, quietly, patiently, and with infinite persistence. Even now, when I recall that night, I can feel it. The faint sounds, the subtle movements, the quiet insistence of the unseen watchers. They do not chase, they do not scream, they do not announce themselves. They wait, deliberate and patient, threading memory into presence, ensuring that anyone who notices, anyone who ventures close, carries the forest's quiet observation with them forever. The morning was gray and still, the kind of quiet that presses on the ears and makes every small sound feel amplified. I packed my things slowly, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. The ranger station seemed heavier than the night before, burdened with the memory of what I had felt within its walls. Dust motes floated in the weak light, and the faint smell of damp wood mixed with the lingering scent of old paper. I paused, tracing my fingers along the edge of a desk, wondering if I was touching the same surface that rangers had touched decades ago. I had thought I could leave and carry nothing but memories, but the forest, and perhaps the station itself, had other plans. The previous night had left a mark on me, subtle yet persistent. Every shadow seemed to linger just a little longer. Every sound, even a distant bird call, felt deliberate, measured. I felt watched, not in a sudden, violent way, but with a patient, deliberate attention that followed me as I moved. Before stepping outside, I glanced around the room one last time. The logs lay stacked neatly, as if waiting for the next person who dared to read them. The maps were folded carefully, showing paths that seemed to bend and twist unnaturally. And in the corner, a small pile of objects, a forgotten thermos, a pair of gloves, an old hat, reminded me that the station had been a temporary home for many. The presence of others, past and perhaps not entirely gone, hung in the air, invisible yet insistent. When I finally opened the door, the wind greeted me, cool and damp, brushing against my skin. The forest outside was alive in its own quiet way, the trees swaying gently, leaves rustling in a rhythm that seemed deliberate, patient, watching. I stepped onto the porch, pausing to take in the clearing. Everything seemed ordinary, yet nothing felt entirely so. I had walked among the shadows, listened to the quiet sounds, and I carried with me the lingering sense that someone or something had observed me, silently noting each movement. I descended the porch steps slowly, feeling the moss under my shoes, soft yet uneven. The air carried a chill that seemed to seep into my bones, reminding me that I was not entirely alone. I stopped mid-step, hearing a faint rustle from the tree line, too subtle for most to notice, yet unmistakable. The wind had not moved. There was no animal visible. Yet the noise, deliberate and patient, sent a shiver through me. I told myself it was nothing. Branches, small animals, the mind playing tricks, but I knew better. The forest, patient and deliberate, had ways of leaving reminders. My backpack felt heavier with each step, though it was no different than before. Perhaps it was the weight of knowing, of having sensed the station and forest as more than mere wood and soil. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision seemed imbued with intention, with quiet observation. The feeling did not rush, did not threaten overtly, but pressed steadily, like water seeping through stone. I felt the eyes of the forest on me, patient and distant, preserving the memory of my presence as it had for decades. I glanced back at the ranger station. Its windows reflected nothing but the gray light of morning, yet I could feel the weight of its gaze. The logs, the maps, the scattered objects, all of it remained behind, yet somehow, through the walls and shadows, the station had absorbed my presence. I understood then why those who had come before had recorded every detail, every subtle observation. The forest's memory was long, deliberate, and patient. Those who noticed it became part of its ongoing record, a faint trace woven into the quiet architecture of the woods. As I began walking down the narrow path leading away from the clearing, the undergrowth brushing lightly against my legs, I noticed small signs along the trail. Broken twigs, impressions in the soil, a slight rearrangement of leaves. Nothing violent, nothing threatening, just subtle markers that someone or something had been here observing. The sensation was unnerving, a quiet reminder that I had not been alone, not in the sense of being attacked, but in the sense of being noted, recorded, remembered. The trail wound through the trees, the canopy above filtering the gray light, casting shifting shadows that seemed almost aware. I kept my pace measured, listening to every rustle, every distant sound. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a branch swinging, a shadow bending, but each time I turned, there was nothing. Still, the sense of observation remained. It was patient, deliberate, and impossibly quiet, like the forest itself had become a watchful guardian, chronicling my steps. I recalled passages from the ranger logs, entries detailing hikers who had sensed similar presences, fleeting glimpses of movement, sounds that did not match any known animal, and the feeling of being watched. Some had called it imagination, others had written it down carefully, as evidence of something beyond understanding. Now I felt the same subtle dread, the quiet pressure that comes not from fear of attack, but from knowing you are observed by something patient and meticulous. The clearing behind me began to shrink as I walked further into the forest, yet the sensation of eyes did not fade. The station, the logs, the maps, they had not merely been objects. They had been conduits, weaving my presence into the fabric of the forest, ensuring that my curiosity, my observations, my fear, were recorded alongside every other visitor who had ventured too far, who had noticed too much. I could feel the weight of it pressing gently, insistent but quiet, embedding itself into memory. I paused on a small ridge, looking back once more. The ranger station was distant now, shadowed by trees, yet I could feel it, the patient weight of presence lingering in the air. The forest seemed to shift subtly, the light filtering differently, the shadows bending as though in acknowledgement. My chest tightened with the realization that the watchers were everywhere, silent, deliberate, preserving, recording. I was not alone. I never had been. Each step forward was careful, deliberate, measured. I did not rush. I did not look for sudden threats. Instead, I acknowledged the quiet, patient observation, letting it coexist with my own awareness. It was a weight, yes, but also a strange, inevitable understanding. The forest held memory, and I had become part of it, a fleeting entry in the ongoing chronicles preserved in soil, shadows, and walls of the old ranger station. By the time I reached the edge of the tree line, the forest had returned to its quiet normalcy, or at least the version of normal that the forest allowed. The wind whispered faintly through the trees, carrying with it the echo of movements I could not confirm. The dirt path under my boots felt steady, familiar, yet I knew the experience would linger. The subtle sense of being watched, observed, remembered. It would follow me far beyond the clearing, far beyond the ranger station, into sleep and thought and memory. When I finally stepped onto the dirt road that led away from the forest, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The forest behind me seemed still, yet I knew it held its patience, quiet and infinite. It did not need to chase me. It did not need to call attention to itself. It merely preserved, observed, and waited, threading my presence into the tapestry of its memory. And somewhere in the shadows, between the trees and the old station, I could feel the watchers still, patient and deliberate, knowing that I had seen, and that I would carry the memory with me forever. I walked the road slowly, keeping my senses attuned, listening to every distant rustle and subtle movement. The forest was patient, and it remembered. I knew I would never be free of that awareness entirely, not because it hunted me, not because it intended harm, but because it had recorded me, and recordings, once made, do not fade. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel the forest's attention threading through the air, a quiet insistence, reminding me that nothing that notices ever truly leaves. The ranger station faded from view behind the trees, but the weight remained. My curiosity, my fear, my awareness, all woven into something larger, something patient and deliberate. The forest had preserved me, as it had preserved all those who came before. And as I continued along the road, I knew that the sense of being watched, the subtle, unrelenting presence, would follow me far beyond that morning, far beyond the forest, lingering in memory, in dreams, in the quiet corners of thought where the mind finally allows itself to rest. The truck's engine hummed softly as I rolled down the narrow forest road, headlights cutting through the fog that clung low to the ground. It was late, well past dusk, and the woods seemed to stretch endlessly on either side, dark and silent. I had taken the night shift on a whim, mostly for the extra pay, though now I wondered why I had agreed to be here alone. The forest had a presence that wasn't immediate, not loud or threatening, but persistent, a quiet weight that pressed against the edges of thought. I parked near the trailhead, leaving the engine running just long enough to warm the cabin air. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that penetrated even through my jacket. I stepped out and felt the soft, uneven dirt beneath my boots, the scent of damp leaves thick in the air. Everything was still, but the silence was not neutral. It was patient, as if the forest itself was waiting, observing. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Night shifts always came with unease, especially when you're alone. The station where I was to wait was small, a modest outpost with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew. A single lamp flickered over the entrance, casting long, hesitant shadows that swayed with the breeze. I stepped inside, the door creaking on its hinges, and set my bag down. The interior was sparse, just a desk, a chair, and some old maps tacked to the wall, but the air felt heavy, almost thick with memory. I pulled up a chair to the window that faced the trail, knowing I would spend the next several hours watching and listening. At first, nothing happened. The trees swayed gently, leaves brushing softly against one another, the occasional bird call echoing from deeper in the woods. But soon, the stillness became more pronounced. The absence of sound made each rustle, each small movement, seem deliberate. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, scanning the shadows between the trees, waiting for shapes that were never quite there. I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear exactly, but with heightened awareness, every nerve alert. I thought about the rangers who had worked these trails before me, about the missing hikers I had read about in the briefing papers. Their disappearances were noted with careful restraint, the words clinical and detached, but the implication was impossible to ignore. People had entered these woods and never returned. The forest was patient. It did not need to rush, and it did not announce itself. It simply preserved memory, recorded presence, and observed carefully. A soft wind gust rattled the cabin's window pane, and I flinched. The sound seemed unusually close, deliberate in timing. My eyes darted outside, trying to catch something, anything in the darkness. I could see only trees, shadows, and the faint glimmer of moonlight through the branches. Still, I felt it, an awareness, patient and deliberate, threading through the night. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with me, as if it, too, was waiting to see what I would do next. I shifted in the chair, crossing my arms and trying to steady my breathing. I told myself I was being watched by imagination alone, the mind playing tricks when it is left in isolation. But I knew better. The stillness had weight. The subtle noises, too soft to define, carried intention. Somewhere in the dark, the forest noticed. It noted every sound of my boots, every creak of the cabin floor, every movement of my flashlight's beam as I traced the trail through the glass. Hours passed in this quiet tension. I rotated the flashlight slowly, illuminating sections of the trail, scanning for animals, trespassers, anything that might break the monotony. Each time I thought I saw movement, a shadow between trees, a flicker at the corner of my eye, it vanished before I could focus, leaving only the lingering sense of presence. It was not aggressive, not violent. It was patient, insistent, and precise, threading observation into my awareness, marking me in the way the logs had marked others before me. I leaned back in the chair, letting my eyes wander over the maps pinned to the wall. Trails, some unofficial, others barely visible even on these sheets, cut through the forest in complex looping paths. Each line on the map seemed alive now, echoing the subtle movements I had glimpsed. Every shift in shadow, every unusual noise, aligned with the routes I would patrol. The forest and its memory felt intertwined, every space watched, every path recorded. I realized I was part of that chronicle, whether I wanted to be or not. A snapping sound to the far left made me sit straighter. My breath caught, steadying as I peered into the darkness. It was faint, almost like the deliberate pause of footsteps on soft soil. I convinced myself it was a branch or a small animal, yet the timing felt different, too conscious, too deliberate to be random. I traced the sound with my eyes, following the line of the trail, but nothing revealed itself. Still, I knew I was being noted, observed by something patient and silent, threading my presence into the record of the woods. Minutes stretched into hours. The moon moved across the sky, shifting the shadows and painting the forest with silver light. Every change felt meaningful, as if the forest was shaping itself in response to my attention, waiting to see what I would notice. I felt my senses sharpen in response, every rustle, every faint whisper of movement, holding a weight I could not name. The night was alive, patient, deliberate, and I was part of its quiet rhythm. By the middle of my shift, I found myself walking along the edge of the trail, flashlight sweeping slowly. Nothing appeared directly in my path, yet the feeling of observation persisted. Every shadow beyond the beam seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was noting my movements, cataloging each step. I moved carefully, trying not to disturb the subtle rhythm of presence I felt pressing against the edges of awareness. The forest did not need to chase me. It only needed to watch. I returned to the cabin and sat again at the window, letting my flashlight sweep the trail in slow arcs. Each sound outside, each subtle shift in shadow, carried an implication. There was intelligence in the quiet, not human intelligence, but deliberate nonetheless. It was patient, indifferent, yet undeniably aware. I read a passage from my briefing notes again, recounting how hikers had reported the sensation of being observed in these woods, how some had never returned. I felt that same subtle dread now, not acute fear, but a persistent, creeping tension threading through my mind. I sipped from my thermos, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and listened. The forest spoke in whispers, subtle and layered, leaves brushing, twigs snapping, shadows bending. I understood that it was not trying to harm me. It was observing, nodding, preserving. Each moment of my attention, each flicker of recognition, became part of its memory. I was aware now that I was both participant and subject, chronicler and catalogued. The final hours of the shift crept by slowly. The forest remained quiet yet insistent, patient and deliberate. I recorded notes in my log, noting each sensation, each sound, each fleeting glimpse of movement that might have been real or might have been a trick of my senses. I wrote carefully, knowing that what I recorded would not simply vanish. It would become part of the forest's narrative, preserved alongside all those who had noticed before me. When my replacement finally arrived, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The night shift was over, but the sensation of observation remained, tucked in the folds of memory, quietly persistent. I walked to the truck, leaving the cabin and trail behind, yet I could feel it. The quiet awareness of the forest, patient and deliberate, threading through shadows, through leaves, through the faint echoes of footsteps. I knew that the woods had not let go of me entirely. Even now, I carry that subtle pressure with me, the memory of eyes, or something like them, watching silently from the darkness, patient and deliberate. The night shift had ended, but the forest's record of my presence would endure, and I would remain aware always of the quiet, creeping vigilance that waits, observes, and preserves everything that happens beneath its canopy. The wind had picked up by the time I stepped back outside, a low, persistent howl threading through the trees. It brushed against my jacket and tugged at the corners of the cabin, carrying the faint rustle of leaves and the subtle, almost imperceptible creak of branches bending under unseen weight. I could feel it brushing past me, a presence in the dark that was patient, deliberate, and somehow aware of me. I walked along the edge of the trail, my boots sinking softly into the damp soil. The flashlight in my hand cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the forest floor in intermittent patches. Every gust of wind shifted the shadows, and for a moment I thought I saw something move just beyond the beam. I blinked, and it was gone. Still, the sensation lingered, the undeniable awareness that I was not alone. Something was tracking me, not visibly, but in the subtle rhythm of the night, in the way the wind seemed to answer each of my movements. The trees swayed, branches brushing against one another, whispering in voices the wind had shaped. Some were almost human in cadence, a faint mimicry of sighs and murmurs. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as imagination, the forest playing tricks on a lone night watcher. But the feeling remained, a quiet tension threading through my chest. Each step I took felt measured, noted, cataloged by the presence moving alongside me in ways I could not see. I stopped at a bend in the trail, pausing to listen. The wind carried more than just leaves. It carried subtle sounds, footsteps that didn't match my own, rustles in the underbrush just beyond the flashlight's reach. They weren't loud. They weren't threatening. They were deliberate, synchronized with my movements, an invisible companion that mirrored my pace and waited patiently for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself whispering into the night, as if speaking might anchor me to reality. "I see you. I know you're there." The wind responded, or at least it felt like it did. A sudden gust brushed my cheek, colder and more precise than the rest, making me flinch. It wasn't random. It had timing, intention. I could feel the forest leaning in closer, shaping itself around my attention. Every shadow, every rustle, every subtle hint of motion aligned with my path along the trail. The forest was patient, but it was aware, and for the first time tonight, I felt the true weight of that awareness pressing against me. I moved slowly, deliberately, scanning every inch of the trail ahead. My flashlight illuminated broken branches, small depressions in the soil, animal tracks that led nowhere and ended abruptly. Each detail was small, subtle, almost inconsequential, yet together they formed a pattern, a narrative of presence and observation that the forest was recording. I realized that the night had a memory, and that memory included me, each cautious step cataloged in ways I could neither see nor fully comprehend. The wind shifted again, and I froze. A sound followed it, faint and deliberate, almost like a footfall, but softer, deliberate, echoing in a rhythm that wasn't quite natural. I turned my flashlight toward it, sweeping slowly, trying to catch a shape, a shadow, a trace of movement. Nothing appeared, yet I knew it was there. I could feel it moving alongside me, a patient observer waiting, always waiting. My pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the undeniable knowledge that I was being noted, measured, accounted for. I tried to focus on familiar details, the trail markers, the tree trunks, the uneven terrain, as though clinging to known things would keep the tension from climbing. But the forest had its own rules. The wind carried subtle whispers, phrases indistinct, but shaped in patterns that made my mind attempt meaning. I could almost convince myself that it was human, that someone was out there, packing in the dark alongside me. But I knew it was. The presence was too patient, too deliberate, too precise. It was not a person. It was something else, something woven into the forest itself. The trail curved sharply, and I adjusted my pace to match the bends. Sweeping the flashlight beam slowly over the underbrush, I thought about the hikers I had read about, those who had vanished without a trace, and the rangers who had chronicled the subtle strangeness of these woods. Each disappearance seemed less like accident and more like a careful selection, the forest itself absorbing and cataloging their presence. Now, I understood the same applied to me. My steps were noted. My presence was cataloged. My awareness alone was enough to be part of its memory. I paused again, the wind suddenly quieting for a heartbeat, leaving the forest in an almost oppressive silence. My own breathing sounded loud, unnatural in the stillness. Then a soft rustle from the left, barely perceptible, made my chest tight. I swung the flashlight toward it, slow and deliberate, trying not to provoke panic in myself. The beam illuminated only the forest floor, broken branches, and the occasional leaf shaking as though stirred by something invisible. And yet, I knew what I had heard. The wind had not caused that sound. Something had moved. Something had paced me, following my steps with careful attention. I resumed walking, slower now, almost ceremoniously, letting my senses expand outward. I noted the way the shadows shifted, the subtle variations in the undergrowth, the way the soil seemed to bear traces of movement too faint for me to track fully. Every detail was a marker, a whisper in the dark telling me that I was being observed. The forest did not rush. It did not chase. It only noted, remembered, and waited. A particularly strong gust rattled the canopy above, and I flinched, feeling it press against my face and shoulders. It was not the wind alone. There was weight, subtle, deliberate, interwoven with the air around me. I kept my flashlight steady, illuminating the ground and trees, trying to reassure myself with the familiar patterns of the trail. But even in the light, I could sense the presence, patient and silent, mirrored in every subtle shift of leaves and branches, every movement I could not name. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, passed in this careful rhythm. I walked, paused, listened, observed, each moment threading my awareness into the fabric of the forest. I realized that it did not matter if I could see or hear it fully. Its patience was its power. It existed in the quiet intervals between sounds, in the shifts of the shadows, in the subtle rhythm of the wind, and I had become part of that rhythm. Finally, I returned to the cabin, hands shaking slightly from the tension I had held at bay. The wind still howled, threading through the trees and brushing against the walls of the cabin, carrying those faint, deliberate noises that seemed to follow me even here. I leaned against the doorframe, listening, letting the forest speak in whispers through the night. Every footstep I had taken, every turn I had made was noted. Every breath I drew, catalogued. I poured a cup of coffee, trying to ground myself in its warmth, but the awareness did not leave me. The wind carried it still, brushing my hair, nudging my jacket, threading around the cabin as if it had slipped inside. I understood then that the forest's presence did not end with the night shift. It waited, remembered, and followed. Patience was its power, and it had all the time it needed. I settled near the window, flashlight resting on the desk, listening as the wind moved through the trees, carrying the faintest hints of movement. Each creak, each rustle, each subtle shift in shadow threaded the tension deeper into my chest. The night was alive in ways I could not define, patient and deliberate. I felt myself becoming part of it, an observer and the observed, catalogued in the subtle, persistent memory of the forest. Hours later, when dawn began to paint the sky in faint grays and golds, the wind softened and the forest seemed to exhale. I stepped outside, the trail bathed in the weak, forgiving light of early morning. The tension did not leave me entirely. It lingered, woven into my awareness, a quiet, creeping pressure reminding me that the forest had not released me. Its memory of my presence endured, patient, deliberate, and endlessly watchful. The deeper I went into the forest, the more the darkness seemed to thicken, not just around me but within me. The trail became a suggestion rather than a path, and my flashlight barely pierced the heavy shadows. The trees leaned in closer, their twisted forms stretching toward me in ways that made me catch my breath, as if they were alive, aware of my presence. Every flicker of movement between the trunks set my nerves taut, though I could never quite tell if it was an animal, the wind, or something else entirely. I remember pausing, standing perfectly still, listening to the rustle of leaves and the groan of timber as it bent under some invisible weight. There was a rhythm here, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The way shadows shifted, the way branches trembled, even the way my own footsteps felt echoed by the forest. It was as if the woods themselves had memory and intention, recording each step I took, marking it in silence. A flicker caught my eye quick, just at the edge of my vision. I turned my flashlight toward it and the shadows leapt back into place, normal, mundane. My heart thudded in my chest. I told myself it was my imagination, that the long hours in solitude were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that the forest had its own stories to tell, and it was patient. Patient enough to let me wander until I noticed the patterns, the disturbances that didn't belong. As I moved forward, I began noticing details I had overlooked before. Small things, a broken strap of a backpack caught on a branch, the weathered handle of a thermos half buried in the dirt, a torn map with edges blackened by fire. Someone or something had been here before me. The remnants weren't recent, yet they were too vivid, too charged with the energy of absence. It felt like the ghosts of the past were pressing against the present, shaping the shadows into stories I wasn't supposed to fully understand. I stopped again, letting the flashlight rest against a tree trunk as I crouched to examine a patch of disturbed earth. Footprints, faint and incomplete, were pressed into the soft soil, leading toward a narrow side trail. They weren't animal tracks, too irregular, too careful in their placement. They spoke of human movement, yes, but of human movement haunted by fear or urgency. I traced the prints with my eyes, imagining the person who had made them, imagining the tension that had propelled them into the dark. And then I felt it, That familiar sensation of being observed, cataloged, followed. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying whispers that were almost audible. Not voices exactly, but the cadence of speech. The rise and fall of syllables shaped by the rustle of leaves, bending air into memory. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but I couldn't. Every time I paused, every time I listened, the whispers threaded closer, wrapping around me, urging me to pay attention, to notice the faint signs of history etched into the forest. I continued along the trail, slower now, letting my senses stretch. The shadows moved in ways that made no sense. A tree branch that should have been still swayed, casting a fleeting silhouette across the undergrowth. A patch of leaves seemed to part as I approached, only to settle immediately into place. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to capture these fleeting movements, but always arriving just a fraction too late. And always there was the sensation of pressure, the quiet insistence that I was not alone, that someone or something was watching, waiting, cataloging each breath. A sudden chill made me shiver. The forest was cooler here, denser. I noticed a faint trail of dried blood along a fallen log, almost hidden in the leaf litter. It wasn't fresh, but it was stark, a quiet testament to some event that had gone unnoticed for years. The forest had seen it. It remembered. And somehow I felt that memory pressing against me, almost tangible, like the wind itself was carrying the residue of fear and pain from another time. I tried to shake off the growing tension, focusing on mundane details. The sound of my boots against the earth, the beam of my flashlight scanning the trees. But even these ordinary things were unsettling now, distorted by the lingering sense of observation. I realized that the forest had a rhythm of its own, one that I had stepped into unwittingly. My presence alone seemed to animate the shadows, to bend them into forms that hinted at unsolved stories, at past misdeeds whispered into the soil and wind. The trail curved and I hesitated. The flashlight's beam caught on something that made me stop cold. A figure, or what resembled a figure, crouched just beyond a fallen trunk. I blinked and it was gone. Nothing remained except the undisturbed leaf litter and the faint echo of my own heartbeat. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a momentary alignment of shadow and imagination. But deep down, I knew that whatever it was had been deliberate. It had allowed me to see it just enough to notice, but not enough to comprehend. I pressed onward, careful, deliberate, each step measured. Every few meters I would pause, scanning, listening. The wind had picked up again, whispering through the canopy, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and wet earth, a combination that prickled at the edges of memory. I could almost imagine voices in the shifting leaves, recounting events long forgotten, the hurried steps of someone fleeing, the whispered warnings of a companion who had vanished, the quiet terror of being alone in these trees. And then I realized with a sinking certainty that the forest had been waiting for me, waiting not in a menacing way, not with malice, but with patience. Every flicker of movement, every shadow that bent unnaturally, every hint of past presence was part of its quiet, enduring watchfulness. The forest remembered, and it remembered me now, marking my path, cataloging my existence with the same meticulous care it had shown countless others. I paused near a gnarled tree, leaning against its rough bark to steady myself. The wind was softer here, almost gentle, but the sense of being observed did not leave me. I could feel it threading through the leaves, curling around my legs, brushing my jacket in ways that mimicked human touch. It was patient, deliberate, unhurried. I felt as if I were part of a long story, one that stretched back beyond my understanding, one that the forest had written in the silence between footsteps and the flicker of shadows. The trail opened slightly, revealing a clearing I hadn't expected. Moonlight spilled over the forest floor, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe. But even in the silver light, the shadows remained alive. Branches swayed in ways they shouldn't. The ground held subtle depressions, faint trails of footprints and scrapes that had no clear origin. Each detail whispered of presence, of history, of stories left unfinished, waiting to be completed or discovered by someone like me. I moved forward carefully, following the uneven trail through the clearing. The wind carried subtle, almost rhythmic sounds now, a cadence that suggested movement just beyond my vision. I turned slowly, scanning each darkened corner, each clump of underbrush. The flashlight flickered momentarily, and in that brief darkness I imagined shapes shifting, moving with a purpose. My chest tightened, and I realized that the forest did not need to reveal itself fully. It only needed to hint, to tease, to remind me that its memory was vast, patient, and unyielding. By the time I emerged back onto a more familiar path, I was acutely aware of the forest's presence beside me. It had shown me fragments, flickers between the trees, hints of histories I could not entirely understand. And yet, those fragments were enough to unsettle, enough to remind me that I was now part of the story. My footsteps were recorded, my pauses catalogued, my awareness noted. The forest watched, silently, patiently, and I knew it would continue to do so long after I had left. The first light of dawn seeped slowly through the trees, pale and hesitant, as if the forest itself was reluctant to reveal its edges. I walked the trail in silence, each step muffled by damp leaves, the echoes of the night still lingering in my mind. The shadows of the trees stretched long, reaching across the forest floor like fingers trying to hold onto the night. It should have felt comforting, the soft wash of daylight, but instead it made the forest seem hollow, almost empty, yet heavy with some unseen presence. I tried to convince myself that the unsettling feeling from last night was fading, that the flickers and whispers, the shadows moving between the trees, were merely products of my imagination. But the truth was, even in the pale morning light, the forest had not released me. It followed, patient, observing, almost as if it wanted me to carry some piece of it away when I left. My heart beat slower now, calmer perhaps, but it was not at ease. The tension had changed shape rather than vanished. It had become a quiet weight pressing on my chest, insistent but unseen. Birdsong filled the clearing ahead, timid and scattered, breaking the oppressive silence. For a moment it felt almost normal. I paused to listen, hoping the sounds of morning would ground me, would remind me that the world was wider than the shadows I had walked through. Yet every note seemed thin, fragile, as if the forest had claimed the rest. And in the gaps between the birds' calls I could still feel it, the gaze of something patient, lingering behind the trees, moving in ways my eyes could not track. I noticed the signs left behind by those who had come before me. Broken branches, faint depressions in the soil, scraps of cloth caught on brambles. They were small, seemingly insignificant details, yet each one whispered stories I could not hear clearly. Some had vanished entirely, leaving only the faintest trace, while others had been left as if deliberately for someone to find. I traced a torn piece of fabric along the edge of the path, and could almost feel the hands that had brushed it there, the hurried, anxious energy that had animated the act. The forest was full of memories, and I had stumbled into its archive. The path looped in ways I hadn't noticed before, returning me to spots that should have felt familiar, yet now seemed different, subtly wrong. Morning light revealed textures I had missed in the darkness. The rough, gnarled bark of old trees, moss thick and slick on the trunks, the tangled roots that twisted across the trail like veins. The forest felt alive in a quieter way than the night had shown me, still, patient, deliberate, but it was not comforting. It was as if the very land remembered, recording every passing soul in its layers of earth and shadow. I walked more slowly now, my senses attuned to every subtle sound, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of a twig somewhere ahead, the distant rush of water over rocks. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing that demanded immediate attention, yet every detail carried weight. Every subtle shift in the forest felt deliberate, as if the woods themselves were guiding me, reminding me that I was not alone, and that I never had been. The memory of the night's flickers between trees haunted each step. The figures I had glimpsed, the shadows that moved unnaturally, they were no longer active, but their presence lingered, frozen in the daylight, just beyond my clarity. At one point, I paused in a small clearing, the morning sun breaking through in thin streams. The light fell across the ground in patterns that seemed intentional, revealing more than just the forest floor. I could see impressions where past hikers had rested, where packs had been set down, and where footprints had vanished into the underbrush. It struck me then how many had walked these woods and never returned. The thought was quiet, almost banal in the light of day, yet it carried a weight that made my stomach tight. The forest had witnessed everything, and it remembered. I noticed a hollow stump at the edge of the clearing. Its bark was split, and inside, the remnants of a campfire long gone were still there, ashes gray and crumbled, with a faint stain of something dark I couldn't identify. My mind conjured images of hurried departures, of small, desperate gestures left behind by someone who had sensed danger just as I had. I felt the same nervous energy pulsing through me now, subtle but undeniable, a quiet insistence that the forest's stories were ongoing, not just memories. The air felt heavier, the forest quieter than it should have been for morning. Even the wind seemed hesitant, carrying only the faintest scent of damp leaves and soil. I kept my flashlight in hand, though it was unnecessary in the growing light, because I felt safer holding a piece of the night with me. Something in me didn't want to release that awareness, that vigilance that had carried me through hours of darkness. The forest had taught me to listen, to notice, to respect the spaces between the trees where the unseen lingered. I reached a fork in the path and hesitated. One trail led back toward the edge of the forest, toward the road I had parked on. The other wound deeper, disappearing behind a thick wall of evergreens. My instincts screamed to leave, to escape the patient gaze I could feel pressing from every direction. And yet, a part of me wanted to follow the other trail, to see how far the memories and shadows extended in the daylight. I didn't. I turned toward the exit, my steps deliberate, measured, each one an acknowledgement that I was leaving. But that some part of me would remain. As I walked, I kept looking back, though the daylight revealed nothing unusual. No figures, no unnatural movements, nothing overt. And yet, I could feel the weight of the forest's watchful memory pressing gently against the back of my mind. The forest had not needed to show itself. It had only needed to exist, to hold the space, and that was enough to unnerve me still. Every tree, every patch of moss, every fallen branch seemed to carry a fragment of what had happened here before, and perhaps what might happen again. When I finally emerged onto the road, the sunlight was stronger, illuminating the edges of the trees and the distant hills. The forest behind me looked calm, peaceful even, almost like any other wooded area bathed in morning light. But I knew better. The calm was a veneer, a surface covering layers of memory and presence that I could not erase. I felt a lingering dread, not sharp or immediate, but subtle and persistent, threaded into my thoughts like a quiet pulse. I reached my car and exhaled slowly, pressing my hands against the hood for a moment. The engine roared to life, and the vibrations under my palms felt grounding, tethering me to the present. And yet, as I drove away, glancing through the rear window at the forest, I knew the memory of the night, the shadows, and the flickers would travel with me. The forest had shared its stories in fragments, glimpses, and hints, and now I carried them. Not as fear alone, but as awareness, as the knowledge that some places, some woods, remember all who wander within them. The road stretched ahead, open and bright, yet in my mind the forest remained alive, patient, and watchful. I would never forget the flickers between the trees, the silent echoes of movement, or the persistent feeling that, even in the calm light of day, I had never truly left. And in that lingering presence, I understood the forest's quiet power. It did not need to frighten outright. It only needed to exist, and the memory of it would be enough.